On the night of April 23, 1935, a wealthy Atlanta man was shot once through his car window in his own driveway. City records listed his occupation as lawyer. The police file told a different story, one worth $50,000 a day. For the next 90 years, this city kept producing men exactly like him. These are the most dangerous gangsters Atlanta ever produced. Section 1. Big Meech and the Black Mafia Family. In the early 2000s, drivers moving through Atlanta started noticing billboards for a company called BMF Entertainment. There were 4 of them around the city. They promoted a music label and a promotion company that threw some of the biggest parties Atlanta had ever seen. Most people driving past those billboards had no idea what they were actually looking at. Federal prosecutors would later say BMF Entertainment was a front, a business built to wash money for one of the largest cocaine operations in American history. The man behind the billboards was Demetrius Flannery, a Detroit native known across the city as Big Meech. By the time the government caught up with him, his organization had been accused of moving thousands of kilograms of cocaine a month across the United States and handling more than $270 million. The story of how a high school kid selling $50 bags on a Detroit corner ended up running Atlanta's most famous drug empire took almost 20 years to build. It took federal agents about 2 years to tear it down. Demetrius Edward Flannery was born on June 21, 1968, in Detroit, Michigan. His younger brother, Terry Lee Flannery, was born on January 10, 1970. The brothers grew up on the southwest side of the city. During their high school years in the late 1980s, they started selling $50 bags of cocaine on Detroit streets. Because of those $50 bags, their small crew became known as the 50 Boys. There was nothing about the operation at that stage that looked different from 1,000 other street crews in 1,000 other American cities. 2 brothers, small amounts of product, hand-to-hand sales. What separated the Flannerys from everyone else came later, and it came from how they thought about the business. They treated cocaine like a supply chain problem. They wanted to control the product from the source to the street, and they wanted to remove as many middlemen as possible. Through the 1990s, the brothers expanded. Demetrius, by his own account in later interviews, had been spending time in Atlanta since the late 1980s and made the city his base. This mattered because Atlanta was becoming the perfect city for what the Flannerys were building. It sat at the crossing point of 3 major interstate highways. It had a booming club scene, a growing hip-hop industry, and a police force tracking dozens of local gangs while something much bigger moved in above them. By 2000, the brothers had built an organization running multi-kilogram cocaine distribution in states including Alabama, California, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, and Tennessee. A later federal investigation estimated the organization had more than 500 members. Around this same time, the crew formally took on a name. They called themselves the Black Mafia Family. The structure was simple and effective. Terry ran the Los Angeles side, which handled incoming shipments from Mexican suppliers. Demetrius ran Atlanta, which handled distribution. Court testimony later described exactly how the Atlanta machine worked. BMF operated 5 stash houses around the city. Roughly every 10 days, vehicles arrived carrying 100 to 150 kilograms of cocaine hidden in secret compartments. Workers at the stash houses unloaded the drugs and stored them. When a customer wanted product, they called in and said their vehicle was ready. Depending on the size of the order, they were directed to a specific stash house. They pulled in, walked inside, and handed over money stacked in $5,000 bundles. A kilogram usually sold for around $20,000. The same vehicles that delivered the cocaine were then loaded with cash and sent back toward the Mexican sources of supply. Inside the houses, some workers spent their days counting money, often in the millions, while others packaged cocaine for the next customer. The organization also received shipments through large containers at the airport, each carrying 100 to 150 kilograms. The DEA later claimed BMF was responsible for moving more than 2,500 kilograms of cocaine a month throughout the United States. That is more than 2.5 tons of cocaine every month, month after month. An operation that size produces a mountain of cash. And cash creates a problem. It has to be explained. Most traffickers solve this quietly. Demetrius Flannery solved it loudly. In the early 2000s, he launched BMF Entertainment, a promotion agency and record label. Prosecutors described it as a front organization built to launder cocaine money, though it was also a real attempt to build a legal income and a way out of the drug world. The label had exactly one artist, a rapper named Blue Da Vinci. But the label's real power was promotion. Meech threw enormous parties, poured money into Atlanta's club scene, and put his brand on those 4 billboards around the city. He moved in circles that included Sean Combs, Jay-Z, T.I., Fabulous, and Trina. According to author Mara Shalhoub, who wrote the first deep investigation of BMF for the Atlanta paper Creative Loafing, and later a full book, Meech was instrumental in the early career of Young Jeezy around 2003, promoting parties for him and pushing his music into the strip clubs where Atlanta rappers were made or broken. Jeezy went on to sign with Def Jam. In 2005, Blue Da Vinci's album World is BMF's was nominated for a Source Award. Inside the organization, Meech was treated as something close to royalty. Creative Loafing described a blanket of silence wrapped around the enterprise, a true mafia code where dishonor was the ultimate sin, and Meech was held up as a kind of demigod. He was generous, he was visible, and he was loved. That visibility was also the beginning of the end. By 2003, the two brothers who built the empire together could barely stand each other. Terry moved to Los Angeles to run his own side of the organization, and by that year, the two rarely spoke. The DEA later caught the heart of the feud on a wiretap. Terry told his brothers he was worried that Demetrius was bringing the wrong kind of attention to the business with his constant, excessive partying. Terry was the quiet one. He wanted the money to move in silence. Meech wanted Atlanta to know his name. On the night of November 11th, 2003, Terry's fear stopped being theoretical. Outside a Buckhead club called Chaos, 2 men were shot to death. One of them was Anthony Jones, known as Wolf, a former bodyguard and childhood friend of Sean Combs. The other was Wolf's friend Lamont Gertie, known as Riz. Demetrius Flannery was arrested in connection with the shooting. He himself had been shot in the buttocks, and he told police he was running away from the gunfire when it happened. He was never indicted. Prosecutors lacked witnesses and evidence, which became a recurring theme around BMF since people who knew things about the organization had a habit of staying quiet. The double murder outside Club Chaos remains unsolved to this day, but the shooting put Demetrius Flannery's name in front of Atlanta homicide investigators, and from that point forward, law enforcement attention around BMF only grew. The violence around the organization did not stop there. On July 25, 2004, at a Midtown Atlanta club called the Velvet Room, a man named Rashanable Drummond, known as Prince, was killed. The incident started small. A Porsche Cayenne Turbo nearly backed into Drummond, and he hit the car to alert the driver. The men inside got out and started beating Drummond and his friends. During the fight, one of Drummond's friends fired a warning shot to break things up. Prosecutors alleged that Fleming Daniels, a top BMF member known as Ill, then retrieved his own gun, returned fire, walked over to Drummond, and shot him as he lay on the ground. A man died outside a nightclub over a fender tap. In September 2004, the violence reached even closer to the city's power structure. A man named Ulysses Hackett and his girlfriend, Misty Carter, were shot to death in her apartment on Highland Avenue in Atlanta. Police said the murders were ordered by Tremaine Graham, known as Kiki, an alleged BMF associate who at the time was the son-in-law of Atlanta Mayor Shirley Franklin. Investigators said Graham believed Hackett was thinking about testifying against BMF and had him and Carter killed to make sure that never happened. In May 2005, the rapper Gucci Mane shot and killed a man named Henry Clark, known as Pookie Loke, during a home invasion in the DeKalb County area. Gucci Mane was cleared on grounds of self-defense, and his lawyers alleged the five-man robbery crew had been sent by BMF, a claim that surfaced during his feud with the BMF-connected Young Jeezy. Weeks later, at a birthday party at Justin's, a restaurant owned by Sean Combs, the nephews of singer Bobby Brown were stabbed in the neck with an ice pick and left permanently disfigured. Witnesses said the man responsible was Marquet Dixon, the younger brother of BMF's own artist, Blue Da Vinci. One organization sat near the center of all of it. While the bodies piled up in Atlanta's nightlife districts, federal agents were already inside BMF's phones. On October 28, 2003, 17 days before the Club Chaos shooting, a 2-year federal task force investigation officially began. It was coordinated by the DEA's Special Operations Division and codenamed Operation Motor City Mafia, a nod to the Flannery's Detroit roots. The case was built piece by piece, and each piece was small. On April 11, 2004, a BMF courier named Jabari Hayes was pulled over in Phelps County, Missouri along Interstate 44, driving a 40-foot motorhome. The stated reason for the stop was swerving over the fog line. A police dog alerted on the vehicle, and officers found roughly 95 kilograms of cocaine packed in suitcases. In September 2004, a wiretap on a small-time Atlanta crack dealer named Raphael Allison, known as Smurf, led a drug task force up the ladder to a mid-level dealer named DeCarlo Hoskins. Hoskins told investigators he had grown up with two brothers, Omari McCree and Jeffrey Lair, who were BMF members capable of supplying kilograms of cocaine on a regular basis. Wiretaps confirmed that McCree was a major distributor for the organization and a favorite of Demetrius himself. The investigation kept narrowing. On November 5, 2004, agents used the wiretaps to have Lair pulled over on Interstate 75 in Atlanta while driving with his girlfriend. In the back seat sat a duffel bag holding 10 kilograms of cocaine. Investigators made an unusual choice that day. They let Lair go, hoping he would lead them deeper into the organization. Instead, McCree and Lair found themselves owing BMF a fortune for the lost cocaine, and they ran. When McCree was picked up on June 8, 2005, he signed a confidential source agreement and described his role in the organization, naming Demetrius Flannery as the source of the cocaine and Chad Brown, known as J-Bo, as the man who supplied him on Meech's behalf. The wall of silence that had protected BMF for years was starting to crack from the inside. By the time charges were filed, the government held 900 pages of typed transcripts from wiretapped conversations on Terry Flannery's phone, gathered over just 5 months. The end came in October 2005. Federal agents arrested around 30 BMF members in a coordinated series of raids. Demetrius Flannery was captured in a large home in a suburb outside Dallas, Texas. Inside, police found a small amount of marijuana, a few ecstasy pills, several weapons locked in a safe, and multiple vehicles on the property. Terry Flannery was captured the same way in St. Louis. During the October raids, the DEA seized $3 million in cash and assets, along with cocaine and numerous weapons. Even before those raids, the investigation had already produced 17 arrests and the seizure of 632 kilograms of cocaine, $5.3 million in cash, and $5.7 million in assets. The brothers were charged under the Continuing Criminal Enterprise Statute, a federal law aimed at people who run ongoing drug organizations, sometimes called the Kingpin Statute. They also faced charges of conspiracy to distribute 5 kilograms or more of cocaine, possession with intent to distribute, and conspiracy to launder money. The case kept growing after the arrests. On June 15, 2006, a second indictment added 16 more people, bringing the total charged to 49. One name on that list made national headlines. Jacob Arabo, famous in the hip-hop world as Jacob the Jeweler, the man who made diamond pieces for the biggest stars in music, was charged with conspiracy to launder more than $270 million in illegally obtained funds. The indictment papers described how the organization moved drug money through banks and wire services to hide where it came from. In one scheme, the group bought winning Michigan State lottery tickets from third parties, paying cash for them, then cashed the tickets in so the money would look legitimate. The government sought forfeiture of more than 30 pieces of jewelry, 13 homes, 35 vehicles including Bentleys, Range Rovers, BMWs, an Aston Martin, and a Lincoln limousine, plus bank accounts, more than $1.2 million in seized currency, and a money judgment totaling $270 million. In July 2007, prosecutors in the Northern District of Georgia indicted 16 more members on cocaine conspiracy charges. In the Atlanta cases, every defendant eventually pleaded guilty except one. Fleming Daniels, the man accused in the Velvet Room killing, took his drug case to trial. He had never been caught holding cocaine and never been recorded on a wiretap discussing drug business. The government convicted him anyway, relying on testimony from cooperating BMF members William Marshall, known as Doc, and Ralph Sims. Marshall told the jury he had personally watched Daniels receive kilograms of cocaine. On December 17, 2008, Daniels was sentenced to 20 years in prison and fined $10,000. On February 26, 2010, he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in the death of Rashanable Drummond and received another 20 years to run at the same time as his drug sentence. The brothers never made it to trial. In November 2007, Demetrius and Terry Flannery both pleaded guilty to running a continuing criminal enterprise. In September 2008, each was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Blue Da Vinci, whose real name is Barima McKnight, was sentenced in October 2008 to 5 years and 4 months. At his sentencing, McKnight said that when he first met Demetrius Flannery, Flannery presented himself as a music industry figure and did not show him the other side of his world until much later. The arrest continued until the organization was gone. The final remaining suspect, Vernon Marcus Coleman, was arrested in Atlanta on July 17, 2009. By then, roughly 150 members and associates of the Black Mafia family had been indicted and arrested. The federal government said those 150 people represented the entire command and control structure of the organization, from the distributors to the stash house operators to the transporters. An empire that once moved tons of cocaine through 5 Atlanta stash houses had been reduced to case numbers in a federal courthouse. The two brothers left prison on very different timelines. Terry Flannery was released to home confinement on May 5, 2020, granted compassionate release over health problems during the effort to slow the spread of COVID-19 inside federal prisons. Demetrius asked for release under the same rules and was denied. The federal judge said it would be premature, pointing to a prison disciplinary record that included possession of a cell phone, possession of weapons, and drug use, and stating that Flannery continued to promote himself as a drug kingpin from behind bars. He was finally released from federal prison in October 2024 and transferred to community confinement in the Miami area, with his sentence officially ending on January 27, 2026. While he sat in prison, his legend grew without him. In 2010, Rick Ross built a hit song around the letters BMF and the name Big Meech. In 2021, the Starz Network launched a drama series about the organization, produced by 50 Cent, in which Demetrius Flannery is played by his own son, Demetrius Flannery Jr. By the spring of 2026, Big Meech was back in Atlanta, appearing at a community summit at Atlanta Technical College and talking publicly about re-entry and second chances. He walked out of prison into a world where his name was a television franchise. Anthony Jones and Lamont Gertie, gunned down outside Club Chaos in 2003, never got that. Their murders were never solved. Rashanable Drummond died on the pavement outside the Velvet Room over a tapped bumper. Ulysses Hackett and Misty Carter were executed in her apartment because someone feared a courtroom. The money was seized, the sentences were served, and the show got renewed. The people killed in BMF's orbit stayed exactly where the organization left them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. BMF proved that in Atlanta, a drug empire could hide inside the music business in plain sight. Almost 20 years later, prosecutors in the same city flipped that story around, claiming a famous record label was actually the cover for a violent street gang. This time, the man they put on trial had a Grammy on his shelf. Section 2. Young Thug and the YSL Case. On the night of May 9, 2022, police arrested one of the most famous musicians on the planet at his home in the Buckhead area of Atlanta. Jeffrey Lamar Williams, known to the world as Young Thug, was 30 years old. He had a Grammy on his resume, a record label that had just topped the Billboard 200, and collaborations with Drake, Travis Scott, and nearly every major name in music. That same night, 27 other people were arrested with him. All of them were named in an 88-page indictment from the Fulton County District Attorney containing 56 counts. The document told a story that had nothing to do with music charts. Prosecutors claimed that YSL, the name of Williams' label, Young Stoner Life, was also the name of something else entirely, a violent street gang called Young Slime Life. They claimed Williams founded it, led it, and sat at the top of a criminal organization tied to murder, drug dealing, carjackings, and shootings stretching back a full decade. What followed became the longest criminal trial in the history of the state of Georgia. A legal circus that burned through 2 judges, saw defendants stabbed in jail, put rap lyrics on trial, and ended in a way almost nobody predicted. Jeffrey Williams was born on August 16, 1991, and raised as the 10th of 11 children in public housing in South Atlanta, in a neighborhood around Cleveland Avenue long marked by poverty and violence. His path out was music. He broke through in 2014 on Rich Gang, The Tour, Part 1, with Rich Homie Quan. Then built one of the most influential catalogs in modern rap with projects like Barter 6 in 2015 and Jeffrey in 2016. His strange, acrobatic voice changed how a generation of rappers sounded. In 2016, he founded his label, Young Stoner Life Records. In 2019, he won a Grammy for Song of the Year as a co-writer of This Is America by Childish Gambino. In 2021, his label's compilation album, Slime Language 2, hit number 1 on the Billboard 200, carrying a roster that included Gunna and features from Drake, Travis Scott, and Lil Baby. By any measure of the music business, Williams had made it all the way. A teenager from the Cleveland Avenue projects had turned himself into an industry. Fulton County prosecutors looked at the same man and described someone very different. According to the indictment and the opening statements at trial, Williams was a founding member of a group called ROC, short for Raised on Cleveland, whose members were known for burglaries and stealing ATM machines. Prosecutors said that after a split inside ROC, Young Slime Life was created around 2012, with Williams as its proclaimed leader, and that the group was aligned with the sex, money, murder set of the National Bloods Gang. In her opening statement, Chief Deputy District Attorney Adrian Love told the jury that for 10 years and counting, the group calling itself Young Slime Life had dominated the Cleveland Avenue community of Fulton County. She described the gang as a crater that sucked in the youth, the innocence, and even the lives of some of its youngest members. Prosecutors called Williams King Slime and argued that members knew exactly who their leader was and knew the price of disobeying him. The defense told a completely different story from day one. They said YSL was a record label, nothing more, and that the state had built a case out of song lyrics, social media posts, and the words of witnesses trying to save themselves. At the center of the state's case sat one killing. On January 10, 2015, a man named Donovan Thomas Jr., known as Big Nut, was shot to death in a drive-by shooting outside a barbershop in Atlanta. Prosecutors said Thomas belonged to a rival gang. They alleged that Williams rented a silver 2014 Infiniti Q50 sedan that other YSL members used to carry out the shooting. Love told jurors the murder was committed for the benefit of YSL and that it set off no less than 50 shootings across the city in the months that followed. One killing outside a barbershop, in the state's telling, lit a fire that burned through Atlanta for years. Prosecutors also alleged that gang members had once reached out to Williams to get his approval for an attempt on the life of a rival rapper, YFN Lucci, who was later stabbed inside the Fulton County Jail and survived. Williams was never charged with pulling a trigger himself. The state's theory, built on Georgia's RICO law, was that the crimes of the organization belonged to the man who led it. His lead lawyer, Brian Steele, rejected all of it and said Williams and Thomas were actually close friends who had spent time together on a tour bus in the weeks before the shooting, and that Williams grieved his death. The indictment landed in May 2022 and shook the music industry. 28 people were charged, including the rapper Gunna, whose real name is Sergio Kitchens, and Williams' own older brother. The case drew national attention for a specific reason. Prosecutors planned to use rap lyrics as evidence of a criminal conspiracy. The judge eventually allowed 17 sets of lyrics into the trial. Among them were lines where prosecutors said Williams boasted about being a leader who called the shots, compared YSL to a school where he was the principal, and connected himself to a body without claiming the killing itself. Prosecutors insisted they had not chased lyrics to solve murders. Love told the court they chased the murders and found the lyrics that pointed to real, specific events. Critics across the country, including legal scholars and free speech advocates, called the tactic a dangerous attack on artistic expression that treated the words of young black artists as confessions instead of art. The debate around the case became bigger than the case itself. Before the trial even started, the indictment began shrinking. In December 2022, Gunna took a plea deal, entering a guilty plea to a single count of racketeering conspiracy and walking free. Williams' brother also pleaded out. In total, 9 people took deals before trial began, and others were separated from the case. One of the most damaging moments for the defense came later, when Trontavious Stevens, known as Tick, an alleged co-founder of YSL, took a deal requiring truthful testimony. On the stand, Stevens told jurors he had co-founded YSL with Williams and another man. Asked to explain the difference between the label and the gang, Stevens said the label Williams created was based on positivity, and the gang was negative. He also testified that Williams had offered him jobs to get him off the streets. The state's own witness described a man pulling people out of street life and a gang existing around him at the same time. That contradiction ran through the entire trial. The trial itself became a historic mess. Jury selection began in January 2023 and took nearly 10 months, longer than any jury selection in Georgia history. Opening statements finally arrived on November 27, 2023. From there, almost everything that could go wrong did. In late 2023, defendant Shannon Stillwell was stabbed inside the Fulton County Jail, halting the proceedings. In June 2024, Williams' lawyer, Brian Steele, was held in contempt and arrested in the middle of the trial after he learned about a private meeting between the judge, prosecutors, and a key state witness, and refused to reveal how he found out. The contempt finding was later thrown out. The scandal around that secret meeting forced Chief Judge Earl Glanville off the case in July 2024. The next judge assigned recused herself because her own courtroom deputy had an inappropriate relationship with one of the defendants. By the time Judge Paige Reese Whitaker took over in July 2024, the case had been described by one defense lawyer as completely off the rails. Witnesses admitted lying. One key witness, Kenneth Copeland, admitted on a recorded jail call and again on the stand that he had been bluffing in 2015 when he told police that Williams handed his rented Infiniti to the shooters at a gas station. The state's case was aging badly in front of the jury. The end came suddenly. In late October 2024, prosecutors made a costly mistake involving witness testimony that opened the door to a possible mistrial, and the dominoes started falling. 3 of Williams' remaining co-defendants took plea deals within days. Then, on October 31, 2024, Williams himself stood up in court and changed his plea. There was no deal with prosecutors. Negotiations had failed. So he entered what is called a blind plea, meaning he handed the decision on his punishment entirely to Judge Whitaker. He pleaded guilty to 6 charges, 1 count of participating in criminal street gang activity, 3 drug charges, 1 count of possessing a firearm during a felony, and 1 count of possessing a machine gun. He pleaded no contest to the 2 biggest charges, racketeering conspiracy, and leading a criminal street gang. Before sentencing, Williams told the court he took full responsibility for his crimes and his charges. Prosecutors asked for 45 years, with 25 of them behind bars. Whitaker went another way. She noted that prosecutors had earlier been willing to offer probation if Williams testified against his co-defendants, which undercut their claim that he was too dangerous to release. She sentenced him to 40 years, structured so that the 5 years of prison time were commuted to time served, followed by 15 years of probation, with 20 years of custody waiting for him if he violates it. After more than 900 days in jail, Williams walked out of the Fulton County Jail that same night. The conditions attached to his freedom were unlike anything in modern music. Williams was banned from the metro Atlanta area for the first 10 years of his probation, allowed back only for weddings, funerals, graduations, serious family medical emergencies, and community service. He was ordered to return 4 times a year to give live presentations against gang and gun violence to school children and community groups. Part of 100 hours of required community service every single year. He was barred from contact with gang members and with everyone connected to the case except 2 people, his brother and Gunna. He was forbidden from using gang signs or gang language, subject to random drug tests, and banned from having guns around him. The judge told him plainly that if there were any violations, he would be coming back to see her. A man who built his career on Atlanta was ordered to stay out of it. 5 weeks later, the rest of the case collapsed. On December 3, 2024, after roughly 16 hours of deliberation across 4 days, the jury returned verdicts for the last two defendants, the two men actually charged with murdering Donovan Thomas Jr. Diamante Kendrick, the rapper known as Yak Gotti, who had been stabbed in jail just 2 days before the verdict, was found not guilty on every single count. Shannon Stillwell, who was also charged in the 2022 shooting death of a man named Shamel Drinks, was acquitted of both murders and every major charge, convicted only of possessing a firearm as a convicted felon. He was sentenced to 10 years with credit for time served and walked out on probation. After the longest and one of the most expensive trials in Georgia history, the state of Georgia had failed to convict a single person of the murder at the center of its case. The verdict was widely described as a major setback for District Attorney Fani Willis. Her office released a short statement saying it always respects the verdict of a jury. The aftermath kept moving. Through 2025, prosecutors tried to have Williams' probation revoked, and a Fulton County judge ruled that his probation would remain intact. In January 2026, the state was ordered to return roughly $150,000 in cash, multiple luxury vehicles, and high-end jewelry that had been seized from him. Williams has since appeared at community events, including a college park festival, where he told young people to focus on school and make better choices. The scoreboard of the YSL case reads strangely from any angle. 28 people indicted, Georgia's longest trial. A superstar who pleaded guilty and no contest, banished from his own hometown for a decade. 2 men acquitted of the killing everything was built around. And Donovan Thomas Jr., shot dead outside a barbershop on January 10, 2015, remains a man whose murder produced years of courtroom warfare and not one murder conviction. The biggest gang case in Atlanta history ended with the question of who killed him legally unanswered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The YSL trial showed how hard it is to convict a modern Atlanta organization, even with 88 pages of charges and years of effort. 4 decades earlier, federal agents in the same city faced a very different target: an Atlanta trafficker running what the government called the largest cocaine ring in the nation's history at that point. He was already in prison when the story started. Then he escaped. Section 3. Harold Rosenthal and Operation Southern Comfort. On September 27, 1983, a man sat in his car in a traffic jam in Bogota, Colombia. Around him, Colombian police officers and American drug agents were closing in. The man stuck in traffic was Harold Joseph Rosenthal, a former bail bondsman from Atlanta, and at that moment he was one of the most wanted drug traffickers in the world. 2 years earlier, he had been a federal prisoner in Memphis, Tennessee, serving a 31-year sentence for drug smuggling. Then he escaped, disappeared into South America, and built something federal officials would later call the largest cocaine trafficking ring in the nation's history up to that point. By the government's numbers, his organization flew more than 5 tons of cocaine into the United States, worth about $3.8 billion. The planes landed in Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. One load even landed at a United States Air Force base outside Atlanta. And the strangest part of that story is that federal agents were the ones flying it. The rise and collapse of Harold Rosenthal's empire played out in barely 2 years, and almost every chapter of it sounds impossible. Rosenthal's connection to Atlanta ran through the bail bonds business. Before he became a fugitive, he worked as a bail bondsman in the city, a job that put him in daily contact with the criminal world he would eventually rule. By the start of the 1980s, that career was over. He had been convicted of drug smuggling and sentenced to 31 years in federal prison. In September 1981, while being held at a federal correctional facility in Memphis, Tennessee, Rosenthal escaped. His lawyers would later make the wild claim that the CIA itself engineered the breakout, an argument a federal prosecutor dismissed in the bluntest terms possible. Whatever the truth of how he got out, where he went next is a matter of court record. Rosenthal fled to Colombia. Most escaped prisoners spend their freedom hiding. Rosenthal spent his building. According to the federal indictment, he made contact with Colombian drug suppliers and financiers and began putting together cocaine shipments aimed at the United States. He based himself around Medellin, the heart of the Colombian cocaine trade, and started recruiting pilots, moneymen, transporters, and ground crews back home. His organization even gained the support of Bahamian immigration and customs officials at West End Airport in the Bahamas, who allowed cocaine flights to land there on the way north. The first big phase of the operation ran through a small airport in Rockwood, Tennessee. During the first week of June 1982, a plane carrying 640 pounds of cocaine flew from Colombia into the Rockwood airport. A man named Garland Watson had the job of securing the airport and moving the load to a stash house. The pilots and the ground crew were not paid in cash. They were paid in cocaine. Several kilograms handed out like wages. The rest of the load was driven to Florida and sold for $370,000. Within the next 2 weeks, 2 more loads came through Rockwood and went the same route into Florida. A 4th load arrived in July 1982, this one weighing more than 1,000 pounds. That was when the operation took its first hit. Acting on a tip, the Drug Enforcement Administration arrested everyone transporting that load. A normal organization might have slowed down after losing 1,000 pounds of product and an entire transport crew. Rosenthal's response was to open new routes. The next phase showed how much money the organization was willing to burn. In the late summer of 1982, one of the operation's planes flew to Colombia to pick up a load. 15 or 16 duffel bags of cocaine were packed on board. The plane crashed on takeoff and burned. The 2 people on board escaped unharmed. The plane and the load were gone, and the organization simply bought another aircraft and tried again. The replacement plane flew to Colombia, took on 15 duffel bags of cocaine, and delivered them to Crystal River, Florida. Another load of 633 pounds was flown into Lafayette, Georgia. That flight ended the same way the 4th Rockwood load did. When the plane touched down in Lafayette, the FBI was waiting, and agents arrested the passengers and several other people. 2 major busts in a matter of months, planes lost, crews jailed, and the cocaine kept coming. Rosenthal was replacing people and aircraft the way other businesses replace worn-out equipment. What Rosenthal did not know was that by the fall of 1982, the federal government was no longer just chasing his organization, it was inside it. In September 1982, the sheriff of Paulding County, Georgia, a rural county west of Atlanta, introduced a DEA agent named Thomas Thompson to a local man named Loy Shipp. Shipp agreed to cooperate with the government, and what he told Agent Thompson was remarkable. Shipp said he had traveled to Medellin, Colombia in July 1982 and met with Rosenthal personally, and that he had received $50,000 as a down payment to buy an aircraft for the smuggling operation. From that moment on, one of Rosenthal's own aircraft suppliers was working for the DEA, and the government rode that connection straight into the heart of the organization. On October 7, 1982, Shipp met in Fort Lauderdale with Philip Bonadonna, one of Rosenthal's top men, and an associate named Charles Alimo. After the meeting, Shipp handed $120,000 of the organization's money directly to Agent Thompson. 6 days later, Shipp and Thompson, working undercover, met Bonadonna and Alimo at the Atlanta airport, where Bonadonna openly discussed buying an aircraft and using vehicles to move drugs to a stash house. Another $50,000 was handed over. On October 19th, Bonadonna and Alimo delivered $250,000. Over the following 2 months, more than $450,000 flowed from the organization into the hands of a federal agent the traffickers believed was one of their own. In January, another Rosenthal man, Robert Dunleavy, delivered $40,000 more. Then came the most surreal moment in the entire case. In February 1983, an undercover DEA agent named Michael Leonard flew to Colombia with Shipp to pick up a load of cocaine for the organization. Duffel bags of cocaine were loaded onto the aircraft in Colombia, and the plane flew north and landed at Dobbins Air Force Base outside Atlanta. A load of roughly 755 pounds of cocaine, imported for one of the biggest trafficking rings in American history, came into the country on a flight arranged and flown as part of a federal sting, touching down on a military installation. The cocaine was unloaded into a van, and Agent Thompson himself drove it to the organization's stash house in the Dallas area of Paulding County. The government now controlled the load and simply watched to see who came for it. 2 days later, 2 white Chevrolet cars with Florida plates left the stash house and headed south. DEA agents followed them the whole way. One car was driven by a married couple, Joseph and Rose Marie Junker, who were arrested near Pompano Beach, Florida, on February 13, 1983. Inside their car were 6 duffel bags holding roughly half of the 755 pounds. The other car was seized and its driver arrested elsewhere in Florida. A husband and wife hauling hundreds of pounds of cocaine down the interstate had driven every mile of the trip under federal surveillance without ever knowing it. While the Georgia pipeline was being quietly dismantled, Rosenthal was running a second air route through the Bahamas. In the fall of 1982, a pilot named Russell Zellner Sr. recruited his own son, Russell Zellner Jr., to help him fly cocaine from Colombia to the Bahamas for Rosenthal. The son helped his father fit an aircraft with equipment for the smuggling runs. This branch of the operation moved 4 loads totaling more than 1,800 pounds of cocaine from Colombia into the Bahamas. Rosenthal invested in his people in unusual ways. In June 1983, an organization member named George Lombardi delivered $12,500 to Zollner Jr. to pay for his father's flight school, because Rosenthal wanted the older Zollner trained to fly one of the smuggling aircraft himself. The organization then spent $60,000 in cash on a Queen Air aircraft, with Lombardi and Dunleavy delivering $75,000 for the purchase. In late August 1983, the Zollners flew that Queen Air to Colombia, where they met Rosenthal in person, and the plane was loaded with 1,000 pounds of cocaine. The destination was Reading, Pennsylvania, but strong winds forced the plane down in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The load was moved into a rented storage unit in Dalton, Georgia, an ordinary storage facility in an ordinary Georgia town holding half a ton of cocaine. The next day, the Zollners and Dunleavy split the load, half into a rental car bound for Florida, half into a recreational vehicle. Weeks later, on September 12, 1983, Lombardi and Dunleavy handed Zollner Jr. $175,000 to buy a bigger plane, a Super DC-3, which he purchased in California for $160,000. On September 25th, the Zollners flew it to Colombia, loaded roughly 500 pounds of cocaine, and flew into Reading, Pennsylvania the very next day. By then, Rosenthal had 1 day of freedom left, and the thing that ended it was his own voice. During the late summer of 1983, the Colombian National Police located Rosenthal's residence in Colombia and, acting on their own, obtained a court order to tap his phone. On one recorded call, Rosenthal discussed murdering the Colombian Minister of Justice, a fugitive American trafficker, talking about killing one of the most powerful officials in Colombia changed everything. The Colombian government decided it wanted Rosenthal out of the country and back in American hands. DEA agents flew down to be present for the takedown. On September 27, 1983, Rosenthal was arrested by Colombian police and American agents while sitting in that Bogotá traffic jam, and his house was searched by Colombian officers with DEA agents watching. The man who had escaped an American prison and built a billion-dollar empire was caught not in a shootout or a raid, but stuck in traffic. Even in custody, Rosenthal never stopped scheming. He was first jailed in Miami, where he reached out to a DEA agent named Charette to discuss possibly cooperating with the government. The court record states plainly what he was actually doing. While Rosenthal was talking cooperation with the DEA, he was planning an escape. Before he could attempt it, he was transferred to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The plotting continued from his cell. In February 1984, FBI agents intercepted letters Rosenthal sent from prison laying out an escape plan involving $1 million and a team of hired commandos. Other letters seized from the Atlanta Penitentiary showed he was still participating in drug smuggling activity from inside the walls. The federal indictment went even further, accusing Rosenthal of ordering the murders of Colombian and American law enforcement agents, both as revenge for his arrest and to stop other members of his ring from being taken down. Outside the prison, his organization kept running without him. Bonadonna took over transportation and distribution, earning $2,000 for every kilo he moved. What Bonadonna did not know was that a man he had been dealing with since 1981, Bruce Litsky, had been working with the FBI since October 1982. On November 3, 1983, Lombardi told Litsky that the head of the organization had been arrested in Colombia. Unaware, he was delivering that news directly to the federal government. The hammer dropped on January 23, 1984. Federal grand jury indictments were unsealed in Atlanta, Miami, Los Angeles, and Little Rock, Arkansas, naming 53 people. The charges were the result of an 18-month investigation by the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, codenamed Operation Southern Comfort. Associate Attorney General D. Lowell Jensen announced that the federal government had uncovered the largest cocaine trafficking ring in the nation's history. The scale backed up the claim. The indictments described roughly 14 shipments totaling about 5 tons of cocaine flown from Colombia into Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania. Agents had seized 2,700 pounds of it. Over a 10-month stretch, members of the ring had personally handed more than $1 million to undercover agents or their operatives. To put the operation in perspective, the government estimated at the time that 30 to 60 tons of cocaine entered the entire country each year. One ring, run by one escaped prisoner, had moved 5 tons of it. The trial opened in federal court in Atlanta in August 1984 under extra security because authorities had received reports that Rosenthal might try to escape again. In the Northern District of Georgia, a 55-count indictment had been returned against 30 defendants. 7 were split off for a separate appeal, and 13 were either fugitives or pleaded guilty, leaving 10 to face the jury. The defense strategy was one of the strangest ever heard in an Atlanta courtroom. Rosenthal's lawyers claimed he had been smuggling cocaine with special permission from the federal government because he was working as a CIA spy gathering information on communist groups in Colombia. They claimed the CIA had even engineered his 1981 prison escape. A federal prosecutor described the CIA claims as pure nonsense and a smokescreen. The CIA and the DEA declined to comment at all. The trial ran 10 weeks. In his closing argument, federal prosecutor Craig Gillen told the jury that Rosenthal and his partners were motivated by nothing more complicated than greed. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On Friday, October 26, 1984, Harold Rosenthal was convicted as the ringleader, found guilty on 14 counts, including the rare charge of engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, the federal kingpin statute reserved for people who organize and supervise major drug operations. 8 of his co-defendants were convicted alongside him, including Bonadonna, Dunleavy, Lombardi, Watson, and both Junkers. One defendant was found not guilty. Judge Ernest Tidwell set sentencing for the week of November 26, 1984, with Rosenthal already owing the remainder of the 31-year sentence he had escaped from before a single new year was added. In July 1986, the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit reviewed every argument Rosenthal and his co-defendants raised and let the convictions stand. The permanent record of the case reads like a list of things that should not be possible. A prisoner escaped a federal facility and became, within 2 years, the head of the largest cocaine ring the country had ever charged. A rural Georgia sheriff's introduction turned one handshake into the undercover operation that gutted the whole network. A federal agent drove 755 pounds of cocaine to a stash house in a van, and a married couple was arrested carrying half of it to Florida. And the man at the center of it all was captured because he sat in traffic in Bogota after being recorded talking about killing a government minister. Harold Rosenthal went back into the federal prison system he had escaped from, this time as the convicted organizer of a $3.8 billion operation, with intercepted letters proving that even from a cell in the Atlanta penitentiary, he had tried to buy his way out with $1 million and hired commandos. The empire lasted 2 years. The consequences were built to last the rest of his life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rosenthal moved his product in tons, by airplane, in an era when Atlanta was just becoming a smuggling hub. 40 years later, the drugs arriving in the city were deadlier. The supplier was one of the most violent cartels on the planet, and the man running the Atlanta operation kept 40 guns in a single apartment. When agents finally kicked in the doors, they found the largest heroin seizure in the history of Georgia. Section 4. Freckleface Sean and the largest heroin seizure in Georgia history. On the morning of July 27, 2020, federal agents moved on a studio apartment in Atlanta. A studio apartment is one room. Most people use that room for a bed, a couch, and maybe a small kitchen table. Inside this one, agents found approximately 28 kilograms of heroin, 17 of them mixed with fentanyl, 6 kilograms of cocaine, 8 kilograms of marijuana, and more than $2.1 million in cash. Hidden throughout the same single room were 40 firearms, along with kilo presses, scales, strainers coated in white powder residue, and a money counter. The man arrested inside was Antonio Deshaun Daniels, a 46-year-old Atlanta drug boss known on the street as Freckleface Sean, and known to his Mexican suppliers by the Spanish version of the same nickname, Pecas. That apartment was only half the story. The same day, agents searched a second Atlanta home the organization used as a stash location, and what they pulled out of it broke a state record that had stood for as long as anyone had been counting. Daniels was not new to the drug trade when agents came through his door. According to the special agent in charge of the DEA's Atlanta office, Daniels had already served time in federal prison for drug distribution and had gone right back to trafficking after his release. By August 2018, according to the government, he was leading a large-scale drug trafficking organization based in Atlanta, and he kept it running until the day of his arrest nearly 2 years later. The city he operated in had changed since the days of planes landing at rural airstrips. By the 2000s, Mexican cartels had turned Atlanta into one of their main distribution hubs for the entire eastern United States, using the same interstates and warehouses that made the city a center for legal shipping. The local kingpin's job in that system was to receive product in bulk from cartel connections, break it down, and push it out across the region. Daniels did that job at a scale few in Georgia had ever matched. The first crack in his operation came from paperwork. In October 2019, federal agents uncovered drug ledgers kept by a Mexico-based trafficking organization. Cartel-level operations track their business the way any company does, with records of what was shipped, to whom, and what was owed. These ledgers contained an entry that stopped investigators cold. They showed that Daniels had received just over 1,000 kilograms of cocaine between August 2018 and the fall of 2019, and that he had sent more than $31 million in drug proceeds back to the organization, money that was eventually transported to Mexico. 1,000 kilograms is 1 metric ton, roughly 2,204 pounds of cocaine, delivered to one man in barely more than a year and paid for in full. A customer who moves a ton of cocaine and returns $31 million without a problem is not a street dealer. He is a partner. The ledger did not just implicate Daniels, it measured him, and the measurement put him among the biggest traffickers ever to operate in the state. Armed with the ledger, agents from the DEA and FBI went to federal judges and secured several court-approved wiretaps on Daniels' phones. For months, investigators listened as the organization did business. The wiretaps let them identify the key members of the Daniels operation and understand how far its reach extended. They mapped the apartments and houses around Metro Atlanta that Daniels used to prepare and distribute drugs. The Doraville Police Department and the DeKalb County Police Department worked alongside the federal agencies as the picture filled in. This is the quiet phase of every major drug case. Nothing visible happens. No doors get kicked. The target keeps making money and feeling safe, while every phone call adds another name, another address, and another count to the eventual indictment. For Daniels, that phase lasted into the summer of 2020. The visible phase arrived on July 27, 2020. When agents executed federal search warrants across the locations they had mapped. The studio apartment where Daniels was arrested told investigators everything about how he operated. The 28 kilograms of heroin found there were not sitting in a warehouse guarded by a crew. They were in the same room as the man himself, alongside more than $2.1 million in cash, stacked and ready for a money counter that sat within arm's reach. The 40 guns were stashed throughout the apartment, in a space where a person could stand in the middle and nearly touch every wall. The kilo presses and strainers showed the room doubled as a processing site, where drugs were cut, packed, and prepared for sale. Everything about the setup said the same thing. Daniels kept his product, his money, his tools, and his firepower close, in one compressed box of a room, trusting almost no one. Federal prosecutors would later note that a number of the guns and the sheer quantity on hand highlighted the violence that shadowed an operation of this size, even though Daniels himself was never charged with hurting anyone. The second location was worse. In a residence in Atlanta that served as a stash house for the organization, agents seized more than 142 kilograms of heroin. Nearly all of it was mixed with fentanyl. Combined with the apartment, the day's haul came to roughly 170 kilograms of heroin, along with cocaine, marijuana, the cash, and the guns. At the time of the takedown, it was the largest seizure of heroin in the history of the state of Georgia. The fentanyl detail matters more than any other number in the case. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid many times stronger than heroin, and when dealers mix it into heroin, users have no way of knowing how strong any given dose is. That is how overdoses happen at scale. A single kilogram of fentanyl-laced heroin does not just represent profit. It represents thousands of individual doses moving into neighborhoods where each one carries a risk of killing the person who takes it. The stash house held more than 142 kilograms of exactly that product, packaged and waiting for distribution across Atlanta and beyond. The government also answered the question of where it all came from. According to the United States Attorney, Daniels' organization was supplied by the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, known as CJNG, a Mexico-based cartel that American authorities rank among the most powerful and violent drug trafficking organizations in the world. This was the modern version of the pipeline Atlanta had seen for decades. In the 1980s, traffickers flew their own planes from Colombia. By the 2010s, the cartels handled importation themselves and needed established local partners to move weight in American cities. The ledgers, the ton of cocaine, and the $31 million flowing south all described that relationship in the cartel's own handwriting. Daniels was the Atlanta end of a supply chain that started in Mexico, and the fentanyl-soaked heroin in his stash house showed exactly what that supply chain was delivering to the city by 2020. On August 11, 2020, a federal grand jury indicted Daniels on charges related to possessing heroin, cocaine, and marijuana with intent to distribute, and possessing a firearm in furtherance of drug trafficking. The United States Attorney at the time said the quantity of drugs, money, and firearms Daniels allegedly controlled highlighted the scale of heroin and cocaine being trafficked into the community by local dealers with high-level ties to international organizations, and accused him of using those ties to flood the district with drugs while collecting the profits. The case was brought as part of Operation Scope, a federal initiative aimed at prosecuting the painkiller, heroin, and fentanyl trade. Facing that mountain of evidence, most defendants plead guilty and negotiate for the lowest number they can get. Daniels did not. He held out for almost 5 years while the case moved through the system, and then he rolled the dice at trial. On June 13, 2025, a federal jury in Atlanta convicted him on every front: conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute heroin, fentanyl, and cocaine, possession with intent to distribute those drugs, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, and possession of a firearm in furtherance of a drug trafficking crime. The sentence came down in January 2026. United States District Judge Thomas W. Thrash Jr. sentenced Daniels, by then 51 years old, to 40 years in federal prison, followed by 10 years of supervised release. The federal system has no parole, so the math on that sentence is straightforward and brutal. United States Attorney Theodore S. Hertzberg said the Daniels organization, supplied by CJNG, had devastated hundreds, if not thousands, of lives through its large-scale distribution of heroin, fentanyl, and cocaine, and called Daniels one of the largest heroin and fentanyl distributors ever to operate in Georgia. The man who once received cocaine by the ton and counted his money by machine will be in his early 90s before the prison portion of his sentence ends. The organization went down with him, one sentencing hearing at a time. Lorene Reeves, 53, pleaded guilty to the drug conspiracy and was sentenced in March 2023 to 4 years and 9 months. Michael Peaker, 57, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering and received 1.5 years in October 2023. Quentin Oliver, 46, pleaded guilty to the drug conspiracy and was sentenced in December 2023 to 10 years and 1 month. William Daniels, 41, pleaded guilty to drug conspiracy, a firearm charge, and money laundering conspiracy, and was sentenced in June 2024 to 15 years. Darrell McCrary Jr., 52, took his case to trial like his boss did, was convicted by a jury, and was sentenced in August 2025 to 25 years. Added together, the Daniels organization absorbed close to a century of federal prison time, and that is before counting the 40 years handed to the man at the top. The permanent record of the case sits in 2 numbers that will likely stand in Georgia for a long time. 1 ton of cocaine, documented in a cartel's own ledger, delivered to a single Atlanta man in about a year, and 170 kilograms of heroin pulled out of 2 Atlanta addresses in a single day, most of it laced with fentanyl, the largest heroin seizure the state had ever recorded. Every kilogram in that stash house was aimed at a street, a block, and eventually a person. The prosecutors who put Daniels away said the damage ran into the hundreds or thousands of lives. And unlike the cash and the cars and the guns, that particular cost can never be seized back. Antonio Daniels spent roughly 2 years at the top of Georgia's heroin trade. The state will still be dealing with what moved through his organization long after the 40 guns from that studio apartment have rusted in an evidence locker. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Daniels ran his empire quietly, from a single room, and his weapon of choice was supply. The next man on this list ran his organization a different way, through fear, rank, and orders passed down a chain of command. And when he wanted a man dead, he did not even need to leave his prison cell to make it happen. Section 5. Gordon Evans and the 9 Trey Gangster Bloods. On November 24, 2015, a 25-year-old man named Jeffrey Anderson spent part of his day watching football at a home in Lawrenceville, Georgia, a suburb northeast of Atlanta. The 2 men watching the game with him were people he knew. At some point that day, according to later police testimony, both men pulled guns on him. Hours after that, police found Anderson dead inside the home, shot twice in the back of the head. A detail from the scene stayed with investigators. His hair was still wet. The order to kill Jeffrey Anderson had not come from anyone in that room, or anyone in that city. According to prosecutors, it came from a prison cell more than 100 miles away, from a man who had been locked up since 2003 and still commanded a criminal organization on the outside. His name was Gordon Evans, and the reason Anderson died, the state said, was a $500 loan. To understand how a man behind bars could reach into a Gwinnett County living room and end a life, the organization behind him matters. The 9 Trey Gangsters are a national criminal gang that started inside the prisons of New York in the early 1990s as a subset of the United Blood Nation, a prison-born branch of the Bloods. From New York, the gang spread down the East Coast and into the Southeast, including Georgia. The Justice Department describes the 9 Trey as strictly hierarchical. Members across the country are divided into separate groups called lines, usually named after the gang's leaders, and every member holds a specific rank within the gang or within a line. Each rank comes with defined duties and responsibilities, almost like job titles in a company. Federal court records from the Georgia investigation lay out some of those titles. A rank called third floor marked a mid-tier leader. A rank called first floor put a member in charge of overseeing the unranked members in a given area. The gang's business, according to federal prosecutors, included murder, assault, robbery, firearms crimes, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, extortion, and trafficking in methamphetamine, marijuana, prescription pills, and heroin. And the whole structure was built to function whether its leaders were free or locked up, because the organization was born in prison in the first place. Gordon Evans had been in the Georgia prison system since 2003, serving a 20-year sentence for armed robbery. On paper, he was just another inmate. In reality, according to both federal and state prosecutors, Evans rose to become the leader of the 9 Trey gangsters in the entire state of Georgia. He went by the alias QB. Federal court filings from the investigation state that agents learned Evans was a leader of the gang and that within the Georgia Department of Corrections, the leadership of the line under Evans, identified in court records as the Farrak line, included other ranked members such as Michael Jackson, who held the mid-tier third floor rank. Evans did not run his organization through visits or letters. He ran it through contraband cell phones, the smuggled devices that have turned prison cells across Georgia into functioning command centers. From inside Hays State Prison in Summerville, Georgia, prosecutors said, Evans issued instructions, tracked his members, handled gang business, and settled disputes. One of those disputes involved Jeffrey Anderson. The dispute was almost unbelievably small. According to testimony from a Gwinnett County police detective at a preliminary hearing, Evans had loaned Anderson $500. The money was supposed to go toward rent. Then Evans saw something on Facebook. The detective testified that posts appeared to show Anderson spending the money at a club instead. From his cell, Evans grew angry. About a month before the killing, a threatening text message was sent to Anderson's phone. When investigators later traced that message, the Gwinnett County District Attorney's Office said it led back to a contraband cell phone inside Hays State Prison, and the man using it was Gordon Evans. A gang leader with a smartphone had scrolled past a Facebook post, decided a 25-year-old owed him respect along with his $500, and typed out a warning that turned out to be a death sentence. The killing itself, as described in the detective's sworn testimony, was drawn out and personal. On November 24, 2015, 2 men identified by police as Darrell Leishon Lewis, 25, and Dossie Davon Mann, 19, spent time watching football with Anderson at the Lawrenceville home. These were not strangers breaking in. They sat with him, watched the game with him, and then pulled guns on him. According to the testimony, the 2 men forced Anderson's head underwater in a bathtub before the shooting began. Both men fired, and Lewis shot Anderson twice in the head. Then they left him there. Police found his body several hours later, and the wet hair investigators noted at the scene matched what the bathtub evidence would later suggest. Anderson died in his own community, at the hands of people he had just spent an afternoon with, over an amount of money that would not cover 1 month of rent in most Atlanta suburbs. Mann and Lewis were charged as the gunmen, and at the time of the early hearings, Lewis was still on the run. The contraband phone that sent the threatening text became the thread that unraveled everything. Gwinnett County investigators built the state murder case against Evans, while federal agents were already circling the larger organization. FBI wiretap records described in federal court filings show how deep the surveillance went. In February 2016, a judge authorized interception of a cell phone believed to be used by Evans himself, a man who was, at that moment, an inmate in state custody. Over that wire, agents intercepted Evans along with other ranked members including Tyrone Clark, Michael Jackson, Kajavius Mitchell, and Gary Sartor. In one series of intercepted text messages, someone sent Evans a list of the gang members present at a location, the kind of attendance report a manager expects from staff. In one intercepted call, Clark updated Evans on gang affairs and reported that another alleged leader was running the gang in Evans's absence. Every message painted the same picture. The Georgia 9 Tray answered to a man in a prison cell, and the prison walls meant nothing. The federal case grew from a seed. On December 14, 2016, prosecutors filed a quiet 3-count indictment against a single member, Kajavius Mitchell. 10 months later, on October 12, 2017, a federal grand jury in the Northern District of Georgia returned a sweeping superseding indictment charging 30 members and associates of the 9 Tray Gangsters. 17 were arrested in coordinated sweeps by the FBI-led Safe Streets Gang Task Force. The indictment alleged that beginning by at least 2013, the defendants committed murder, attempted murder, murder conspiracies, robbery, extortion, firearms crimes, drug trafficking, and obstruction of justice in furtherance of the gang. It counted 1 completed murder, 2 attempted murders, and multiple additional murder conspiracies. Jeffrey Anderson's killing was listed in the indictment as a racketeering activity, and the indictment alleged that Evans ordered it from prison. Evans was also charged federally with witness tampering and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder in aid of racketeering. The United States Attorney at the time, B.J. Pack, made a point that separated this case from most gang prosecutions. The violence, he said, was directed largely at the gang's own members, and the 9 Tray in this case appeared willing to kill someone over the smallest perceived slight. A $500 loan and a Facebook post fit that description exactly. 3 of the federal defendants shared something with their leader. Gary Sartor, Patrick Capel, and Michael Jackson were all in Georgia Department of Corrections custody during the time they participated in the conspiracy, according to their later guilty pleas. The gang was not merely surviving inside Georgia's prisons, it was operating from them at multiple levels of rank at the same time. Georgia was living through an epidemic of exactly this problem in those years. In a separate DeKalb County case, prosecutors charged Kenneth Eric Jackson, the highest-ranking member of the Sex, Money, Murder Bloods in Georgia, with using a contraband phone at Autry State Prison to authorize a 2014 retaliation shooting that killed a 9-month-old baby boy named Kendarius Edwards Jr. Different gang, different prison, same machinery. A smuggled phone, a ranked leader, and an order that ended a life on the outside. Evans faced the state's murder case first. In August 2018, he stood trial in Gwinnett County for Jeffrey Anderson's death. The trial lasted 2 weeks. prosecutors laid out the loan, the Facebook posts, the threatening text traced to the contraband phone at Hayes State Prison, and Evans's position atop the Georgia 9 tray. On August 17, 2018, the jury found Gordon Evans, then 37 years old, guilty on every count: 3 counts of felony murder, malice murder, 2 counts of criminal street gang activity, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and aggravated battery. He never touched the gun, never held Anderson under the water, and never set foot in that Lawrenceville home. And under Georgia law, none of that mattered. The order was his, so the murder was his. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 20 additional years to run consecutively. Malice murder is Georgia's term for intentional murder, and life without the possibility of parole means exactly what it says. There is no review date, no hearing, and no path out. The federal RICO case ground through the courts for years afterward and steadily emptied the gang's leadership into federal prison. In September 2021, 6 members pleaded guilty to RICO conspiracy in a series of hearings. Tyrone Clark, known as Tight Eye, Joseph Riley III, known as Joe Blow, Gary Sarter, known as G. Stacks, Patrick Capel, known as Zoe, Michael Jackson, known as MJ, and Brandon Asbury, known as B5. Each admitted involvement in planning, facilitating, and executing acts of violence and in the gang's trafficking of methamphetamine, marijuana, and Xanax. And each faced a statutory maximum of life in prison. Later, Kajavius Mitchell, the man whose small 2016 indictment had started the federal case, and Devontae Marshall, known as Street Monster, who held the first floor rank overseeing unranked members in his area, pleaded guilty to RICO conspiracy as well. The acting United States Attorney summed up the organization's real nature when the pleas came in. The gang offered members a sense of belonging and a way to make money, he said. But those same members were most often the targets of the gang's violence, based solely on the whims of its leaders. Jeffrey Anderson had been connected to the world of the 9 tray. The whim that killed him belonged to the man at the top. The permanent arithmetic of the case is hard to look at directly. Jeffrey Anderson was 25 years old. The debt was $500. The evidence that angered his killer was a Facebook post about a night at a club. For that, 2 men he trusted enough to watch football with held his head under bathwater and shot him. And police found him hours later with his hair still wet. Gordon Evans was already scheduled to be in prison until roughly 2023 on his armed robbery sentence. Because of a text message he could not resist sending from a smuggled phone, he converted a release date into a death date. He will leave Georgia's prison system in a coffin, and the organization he commanded from inside it was dismantled member by member in federal court, largely because its own leader could not let go of $500. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 9 tray punished their own on the whims of whoever held rank. The next organization on this list took the same idea and turned it into formal policy. A national gang with a written chain of command and a dedicated enforcement team whose entire job was disciplining members through beatings or death. In Atlanta, the man overseeing that team held the title in writing, and in 2018, his enforcers put one of their own in the ground. Section 6. Dolafil and the Gangster Disciples Enforcement Team. On March 17, 2019, police officers walked cadaver dogs through a storage facility in Lawrenceville, Georgia. They were looking for two men from Athens, Derek Ruff and Joshua Jackson, who had vanished a few days before Christmas. The dogs found them. Both men had been shot to death on December 19, 2018, and their bodies had been hidden inside a storage unit for almost 3 months while their families searched, posted, and waited. The men had driven to Lawrenceville that December night, believing they were doing a favor for a friend of the organization. The truth was that they had been lured to their deaths on the direct orders of a high-ranking Gangster Disciples leader from Atlanta, a man who had branded them as informants. They were not informants. They had never spoken to law enforcement at all. They died over a rumor inside the head of a fugitive, and the man who gave the order held a formal title in a national gang whose rules made his order something closer to company policy. The Gangster Disciples are one of the largest and most organized criminal gangs in the United States, with roots in Chicago going back to the 1970s. Federal prosecutors who have taken the gang apart in Georgia describe an organization that operates less like a loose street crew and more like a corporation with a violent product. The gang is highly structured, with a hierarchy of leadership posts known as Positions of Authority, or POAs. Rules are strict and strictly enforced. And to enforce them, the gang maintains something most organizations never put in writing: enforcement teams. According to court documents in this case, enforcement teams within the Gangster Disciples are directed to discipline gang members for violations of gang rules, and the approved methods of discipline are physical assault or murder. That sentence deserves to be read plainly. A national organization with tens of thousands of members maintains internal units whose defined job is beating or killing the organization's own people. The gang also runs a parallel female wing called the Sisters of the Struggle, known as SOS, with its own members and its own leadership positions working alongside the men. Philman Deshawn Chambers of Atlanta, known in gang circles as Dollar Phil, sat inside that machinery at a high level. According to court documents, Chambers held a position of authority within the National Gangster Disciples organization, and his authority included overseeing members of the enforcement team. Under him on that team was Leslie Chappell Green of Stone Mountain, known as GRIP, who held the formal title of Assistant Chief Enforcer. In Athens, about 70 miles east of Atlanta, the gang's presence included Andrea Page Browner, known as Drea, a member of the Sisters of the Struggle who held a leadership position of her own. Between the three of them, the chain of command was complete. Browner could gather information on the ground in Athens. Chambers could give orders. Green could carry them out. In December 2018, that chain activated, and within 9 days it produced 3 bodies. The trigger came on December 10, 2018, when a Gangster Disciples member named Walter Brown was murdered in Athens. In the gang's world, the killing of a member demands an answer, and evidence presented at trial proved that Chambers and Browner set out to deliver one. They came to believe that 3 Athens residents, never publicly named in court documents, were responsible for Brown's death.
What followed was not an investigation in any real sense. It was a hunt run on gang logic, where being connected to a suspect was as dangerous as being one. On December 14, 2018, 4 days after Brown died, Browner met a man named Rodriguez Apollo Rucker at a motel in downtown Athens. During that meeting, she learned one fact about him. Rucker was related to one of the people she believed had killed Walter Brown. He was not one of the 3 suspected men himself. He was a relative. That was enough. Browner sent text messages directing Chambers to travel to the motel, and Chambers came. When Rucker left, Chambers followed him home. Then he shot Rodriguez Rucker and killed him. A man died in Athens that night for the crime of sharing blood with someone the gang suspected. The retaliation for Walter Brown's murder had not touched a single one of the 3 people the gang actually blamed. It had simply added a 4th family to the circle of grief, and the 2 people responsible knew immediately what came next. Browner notified a Gangster Disciples associate that she and Chambers would be leaving town because the police would be looking for them. They ran west. On December 15, 2018, 1 day after the Rucker murder, law enforcement caught up with Browner in Mount Enterprise, Texas, a tiny town more than 800 miles from Athens. She was taken into custody. Chambers had been in the vehicle with her, and when officers moved in, he fled and got away. He made his way to a Gangster Disciple safe house in Killeen, Texas, and went underground. The gang's national infrastructure was now sheltering him. And from that hiding spot, a man already responsible for one murder began turning over a question in his mind. The police had found Browner fast. Somebody, he decided, must be talking. Chambers focused his suspicion on 2 men back in Athens, Derek Ruff and Joshua Jackson. Federal prosecutors stated the truth about them in the plainest language possible. Ruff and Jackson were, in fact, not cooperating with law enforcement. Chambers incorrectly concluded that they were snitches. In the world of the Gangster Disciples, that conclusion carried a sentence, and Chambers had the rank to impose it. He directed Leslie Green, his subordinate on the enforcement team, to carry out the murders of both men. The order traveled through the same channels the whole conspiracy did, and investigators would later recover it because text messages and intercepted phone calls between Chambers, Green, and 2 other members, Robert Maurice Carlyle of Lithonia, known as Different, and Shabazz Larry Guidry of Decatur, known as Lil Larry, laid out the entire plot in the participants' own words. The murder plan was built on a lie shaped exactly to its victims. Ruff and Jackson were told they were going to help the boss. Green, following Chambers' direction, lured the 2 men to drive from Athens to Lawrenceville to break into storage sheds and steal items that would be sent to Chambers as aid and assistance while he hid from law enforcement at the Texas safe house. The story worked because it made sense. A leader on the run needs support, and helping him is what loyal associates do. Ruff and Jackson made the drive, believing they were proving their value to the organization. On December 19, 2018, at the storage facility, they were murdered, and their bodies were concealed inside the storage unit. The 2 men had been executed for treason they never committed, by an organization they were trying to help, at the exact moment they were helping it.
What the conspirators did next showed how far the cover-up was meant to go. Additional messages between Chambers, Green, Carlisle, and Guidry revealed that the four men discussed how to dispose of the victims' bodies. The options they weighed included burning the bodies or dumping them in a landfill. If either plan had been carried out, the families of Derek Ruff and Joshua Jackson might never have learned what happened to them. The plans were never executed. Law enforcement got there first. Through the winter, investigators from the FBI's Middle Georgia Safe Streets Gang Task Force, the Athens Clark County Police Department, and the Gwinnett County Police Department pieced the case together, and on March 17, 2019, officers with cadaver dogs located the bodies in the Lawrenceville storage unit. Arrests followed before a single body could be burned or buried in a landfill. 3 months of silence ended for two families in the worst way an ending can come. But it came with something the gang had tried to erase. The truth, documented in the conspirators' own texts and calls. The federal case landed in the Middle District of Georgia and moved toward trial over the following years. In June 2023, the two men on the edges of the conspiracy folded first. Robert Carlisle and Shabazz Guidry each pleaded guilty on June 8, 2023 to RICO conspiracy, with each facing a maximum of life in prison. Chambers, Browner, and Green went to trial in Macon before Chief United States District Judge Mark T. Treadwell. In August 2023, a federal jury convicted all three. Chambers was found guilty of RICO conspiracy, violent crime in aid of racketeering murder, known as Vicar murder, carrying and using a firearm during a crime of violence, and causing the death of a person using a firearm. The Vicar murder conviction carried a mandatory minimum sentence of life in prison, meaning the judge had no discretion to go lower. Browner was convicted of RICO conspiracy, Vicar murder, and related crimes. Green was convicted for his role as the enforcement team killer who had lured Ruff and Jackson to Lawrenceville. The sentences came down in early 2024. In February, Leslie Green, the assistant chief enforcer who pulled off the storage unit murders, was sentenced to life in prison. In March, Philmon Chambers stood before the court and received 2 consecutive life terms plus an additional 120 months, which is 10 more years stacked on top of 2 lifetimes, followed by 5 years of supervised release that will never matter. Andrea Browner was sentenced to 2 concurrent 30-year terms, followed by 5 years of supervised release. United States Attorney Peter D. Leary said the murderous crimes of Chambers and his co-conspirators had caused intense pain and suffering for 3 Georgia families whose loved ones were taken from them in a heinous manner. Athens Clark County Police Chief Jerry Salters said the sentences could never undo the loss, but sent the message that justice would prevail. Carlisle and Guidry, the 2 who pleaded guilty, awaited their own sentencing hearings in the weeks that followed. The Athens case was not an isolated eruption. It was one node of a Georgia-wide enforcement culture that federal prosecutors had been dismantling for years. In a separate Atlanta-based RICO case, a gangster disciples leader named Lewis Mobley of Atlanta was convicted of racketeering conspiracy involving murder, attempted murder in aid of racketeering, and drug and gun crimes. Evidence in that case showed Mobley held a position in the gang's security and enforcement arm and exercised leadership over an enforcement squad known within the gang as the Hate Committee, a unit responsible for committing murders, shootings, and other violence. By the time that prosecution wound down, 27 defendants had pleaded guilty and 5 more had been convicted at a separate trial. 2 different Georgia cases, 2 different enforcement units, the same design. The Gangster disciples did not treat violence as a breakdown of order.
Violence was the order, assigned to titled personnel, directed at the gang's own people as often as at anyone else. The permanent damage of the December 2018 spree sits in its arithmetic. Walter Brown, a gang member, was murdered, and his killing was never answered by anything resembling justice from the people who claimed to avenge him. Rodriguez Rucker was shot dead outside his own home for being related to a suspect. Derek Ruff and Joshua Jackson were executed over an accusation that federal prosecutors flatly confirmed was false, and their bodies sat in a rented storage unit through Christmas, New Year's Day, and most of the winter, while the men who put them there discussed fire and landfills. Philmon Chambers will die in federal prison, twice over by the terms of his sentence. None of that returns a single one of the 3 men, and none of it changes the fact that the entire chain of killing started with an organization that wrote discipline by murder into its own structure and gave a man from Atlanta the title to use it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Gangster disciples built their violence into an org chart with ranks, teams, and formal titles. Half a century before them, Georgia had a criminal network with almost no structure at all. Just bootleggers, bank robbers, and killers for hire scattered across the back roads. And out of that loose world came the man state investigators would call the most dangerous ever produced in Georgia, with a body count that may have passed 50. Section 7. Billy Sunday Burt and the Dixie Mafia. On the morning of August 7, 1967, a 40-year-old prosecutor named Floyd Horde walked out of his house near Jefferson, Georgia, and got into his 1967 Ford Galaxy. He was due in court that day to testify before a grand jury about a bootlegging boss he had spent 2 years trying to bring down. Horde turned the key. 10 sticks of dynamite wired to the ignition the night before tore the car apart and killed him in his own front yard while his wife and children ran outside to find him. The men behind the bombing were bootleggers. A 76-year-old liquor boss named Cliff Park was convicted of ordering it. A man named Douglas Pinion arranged the $5,500 contract, and 3 others bought the dynamite in South Carolina and wired it to the coil. All of them went to prison. The murder of a sitting prosecutor announced to the entire state what the whiskey men of North Georgia were capable of. And the loose criminal world that killing came from soon had a name people whispered across 4 counties: the Dixie Mafia. Out of that same world came a quiet, wiry moonshine runner from Barrow County, who law enforcement would eventually call the most dangerous man in Georgia history. His name was Billy Sunday Burt, and the officers who chased him for years believe he killed more people than Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy combined. Burt was born in 1937 in Barrow County, Georgia, into extreme poverty. His mother named him after Billy Sunday, the famous traveling preacher, a choice that aged into dark irony. He barely attended school and could not read.
As a young man, he worked in sawmills and construction, and then he found the trade that made him. In the hills of North Georgia in the 1950s and 1960s, making and hauling untaxed whiskey was a way of life, and Bert became a runner in the moonshine operation of a bootlegger named Harold Chansey, working alongside Chansey's cousin Donald Chansey and a man named Billy Wayne Davis. Behind the wheel, Bert was close to untouchable. His 1970 Mercury Cyclone became legendary as the fastest whiskey car ever built in the region. And in the 3 years it ran liquor across the Southeast, it was never caught in a chase. Decades later, at the annual Mountain Moonshine Festival in Dawsonville, Bert was inducted into the Moonshine Hall of Fame as the best moonshine driver ever. That is the version of Billy Bert that sounds like a folktale. The other version was documented by sheriffs, GBI agents, and courtrooms across Georgia. The organization around him barely qualified as an organization. The Dixie Mafia was not a structured family like the Italian mob. It was a loose network of bootleggers, thieves, and killers spread across Barrow, Walton, Jackson, and Oconee counties, with connections reaching into metro Atlanta and across state lines. There was no formal chain of command. Leadership followed the money, and whoever had the most of it called the jobs. The members were not bound by blood or ritual. They were bound by one rule, the only rule the group enforced: nobody talks to the police. Some law enforcement officials have argued the Dixie Mafia label never really fit Georgia, and that Bert simply ran a loose gang with rotating members and a couple of loyal partners. Whatever the name, the output was the same. One state investigator described the years between 1968 and 1974 as a wave of killings, bombings, robberies, arson, and burglaries washing over those 4 rural counties, with Bert's name surfacing behind case after case. The violence in Bert did not stop at the edges of business. He once shot his own brother, Ray Bert, 5 times during a fight that broke out in a pool hall Billy owned. Ray survived. Around North Georgia, Bert and his crew were linked to buildings that exploded in the night, and even to the bombing of a Winder police car. In 1968, while moving stolen property, Bert met Billy Wayne Davis, the man whose partnership would define the deadliest stretch of his life and whose betrayal would eventually end it. In 1971, a couple named Warren and Rosina Matthews were shot to death in Marietta in the Atlanta suburbs. Years later, Bert himself testified in court that he had helped Davis gun the Matthews down. By then, the two men hated each other and were busy burying one another with testimony, which is the only reason the public ever learned what either of them had done. The lawmen who spent their careers on Bert never agreed on a final number. Walton County Sheriff Frank Thornton said investigators had put together facts tying Bert to as many as 28 killings. Douglas County Sheriff Earl Lee estimated he had probably killed 56 people. Retired GBI investigator Bob Ingram, who led the case against him, says he can definitively link Bert to more than 30 murders and estimates the true count between 52 and 56, most of them packed into the years 1970 to 1974. Bert told people he had killed more than 50 himself. He was only ever convicted in 3 deaths. One of the cases that haunted another state for half a century shows how far his work traveled. On February 3, 1972, during a heavy snowstorm, a family of 3 was found strangled to death in their home outside Boone, North Carolina. Bryce Durham was 51. His wife Virginia was 44. Their son Bobby was 18. The Watauga County Sheriff's Office worked the case for decades and got nowhere, because the killers had no connection whatsoever to the victims or the area.
They had dropped out of the sky, done their work, and vanished back into Georgia.
The break finally came almost 50 years later. While researching a book about his father, Bert's youngest son, Shane, revealed that during a prison visit, his father had admitted killing 3 people in the North Carolina mountains during a snowstorm. Investigators took the lead to the last living member of the old crew, Billy Wayne Davis, then serving life in a Georgia prison. Davis confirmed it. He had been the getaway driver, and he said the Durham family was killed as a hired job. In February 2022, North Carolina authorities announced the 50-year-old case was closed, naming Bert Davis, Bobby Jean Gaddis, and Charles David Reed. The investigator who took Davis's confession noted the thing that stayed with her. He showed no emotion about it at all. The crime that finally caged Billy Burt started with a piece of gossip about buried money. According to the evidence laid out in the Georgia Supreme Court's own record, a farmhand named Carswell Tapley mentioned to his employer that an elderly couple in the small town of Wren's, Georgia, kept a large amount of cash hidden at their home. Reed Oliver Fleming Sr. was a retired used car dealer who did not trust banks. He and his wife Lois had buried their savings in fruit jars. That information traveled through the network the way everything did, from a farm in Washington County to Billy Wayne Davis, who ran a car lot in Austell on the west side of Metro Atlanta. And from Davis to Burt. In the days before Christmas 1973, the crew scouted the town. On Friday, December 21st, Burt called Davis and asked him to come to a motel in Atlanta. Davis found Burt there with Bobby Jean Gaddis and Charles Reed, and Burt explained the 3 of them were planning a trip to Wren's to take care of the business. Burt borrowed Davis's car for the trip. He also borrowed Davis's pistol. A robbery and double murder in a town 130 miles east was organized in an Atlanta motel room the way other men plan a weekend fishing trip. The next day, the crew handled final details with the same calm. Burt swapped vehicles because the first car had already been seen in Wren's, taking a green 1971 Cadillac off a body shop operator in Austell. That afternoon, Gaddis walked onto Mr. Fleming's used car lot in Wren's and asked questions about a pickup truck, getting a look at the old man hours before killing him. After dark on December 22, 1973, Burt, Gaddis, and Reed knocked on the Flemings' door. When Mr. Fleming answered, they told him they wanted to buy the pickup truck. He told them to come back in daylight. They forced their way inside and tied up the elderly couple. While Gaddis stood guard, Burt and Reed moved the cars down a side road so the driveway would look normal. Then they went to work on the Flemings. The 2 were tortured for their money. Both were found with their hands and feet bound and coat hangers wrapped around their necks. According to Davis's testimony about what the men told him afterward, they joked that Mrs. Fleming was hard of hearing, but that her hearing improved considerably when the coat hanger around her throat was tightened. Dr. Larry Howard of the State Crime Laboratory concluded the deaths were not instantaneous. The Flemings died somewhere around 10 or 11 that night, at the end of a prolonged ordeal. And the killers dug roughly $4,000 in pennies, nickels, and dimes out of buried fruit jars and left with it. 2 elderly people were strangled to death by professionals for a pile of coins. What happened next is the reason the case ever reached a courtroom. At about 2 a.m, Davis met Burt, Gaddis, and Reed at an interstate interchange. And Burt told him there had been difficulty in Rennes and that they had killed the Flemings. Davis wanted his pistol back. Reed remembered leaving it inside the Flemings' house. So Burt, Gaddis, and Davis drove back toward the murder scene to retrieve it. And about 12 miles outside Rennes, the Cadillac broke down. At 4 a.m, Billy Burt stood on the side of a dark highway, flagging down passing cars with a flashlight, hours after a double murder a few miles from the bodies. 2 local men stopped to help. They got a long look at the stranded motorists. The crew fixed the car, retrieved the gun, and went home. But the breakdown had planted witnesses on the timeline, and the whole night had planted something worse for Burt. Davis now knew everything. The partnership rotted into war. Davis was convicted in 1976 of murdering a man named Sibley. And as the 2 old partners turned on each other, Davis made his deal and testified. In January 1975, a Jefferson County grand jury indicted Burt, Gaddis, Reed, and a 4th man for the Fleming murders. Burt was already sitting in federal custody in Illinois on an unrelated conviction when his lawyer tracked him down to tell him Georgia wanted him for murder. At trial, the jury heard Davis walk through the entire operation: the motel meeting, the borrowed pistol, the swapped cars, the confession at the interstate, the trip back for the gun. The 2 men who had stopped to help the stranded Cadillac put Burt on that road. Burt claimed he had spent the night at home and only left at 2:30 in the morning to buy his 14-year-old son a Christmas car from Davis's lot. The jury did not believe him. Billy Sunday Burt was convicted of 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of armed robbery, and burglary, and sentenced to death twice over, once for Reed Fleming and once for Lois Fleming. Gaddis was also sentenced to death. Reed received life sentences. Burt's death sentences were later converted to life in prison, which meant Georgia's most prolific killer would die slowly instead of quickly, in a cell instead of a chair. He spent more than 4 decades inside. In 1992, nearly 20 years into his time, Burt was baptized in prison, and in his final years, his family says, he wanted to pray with them at every visit before anything else was said. The man who could not read sent his sons out with pieces of his story over the years, and those pieces kept solving murders long after his arrest, including the Durham family case in North Carolina. He never stopped being dangerous as a fact of history, even when he stopped being dangerous as a man. In 2017, after roughly 43 years behind bars, Billy Sunday Burt hanged himself in his cell. He was in his 80th year. The official record charges him with 3 killings. The men who knew his work best believe the real number sits somewhere between 30 and 56, scattered in shallow graves, cold case files, and closed cases across at least 2 states, most of the victims' families never receiving a courtroom, a verdict, or an answer. Reed and Lois Fleming got their verdict. It cost them everything first, and the money that bought their deaths amounted to jars of buried change. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Burt ran whiskey in the era when illegal liquor was the engine of Southern crime, and he died its most feared product. But he was not the first man to get rich running liquor through Atlanta, and not the first to die violently because of it. 40 years before Burt's peak, Atlanta had an actual liquor king. A prohibition boss who built a fortune, moved into a mansion, and ended up shot dead inside it in a case that pointed in a direction nobody wanted to look.
Section 8. Eddie Guyol, the Liquor King Atlanta Forgot. On the late evening of April 23, 1935, a well-dressed couple walked down the stone path in front of their mansion on Pelham Road in Atlanta, heading out for a night at the movies. They climbed into the sedan parked in their driveway and shut the doors. Then a man stepped out of the shadows, holding a gun. The wife assumed it was a robbery and began pulling off her jewelry to hide it. The gunman stepped up onto the running board of the car and, according to her account, he spoke directly to her husband, telling Eddie that he knew he had this coming. Then he pushed a .45 caliber pistol through the driver's side window and fired once. The bullet hit the driver in the right cheek and exited through the top of his head, killing him instantly. His wife caught one detail of the killer's face, eyes she would later describe as being like a snake's, before she screamed and passed out. The shooter melted back into the dark. The man slumped behind the wheel with $2,500 in his pocket was Eddie Guyol. And for roughly 15 years, he had been one of the most powerful criminals in the city of Atlanta, first as its liquor king, then as its numbers king. Most of his neighbors had no idea either man existed. Before the money, Guyol was a salesman. He worked for one of Atlanta's packing houses in the years before alcohol became illegal, an ordinary job in an ordinary career. Then the law handed him the opportunity of a lifetime. When Prohibition shut down legal alcohol across America in 1920, it did not shut down thirst, and every city in the country instantly contained a massive market that no legitimate business was allowed to serve. Men who were willing to break the law stepped into that gap and became rich faster than any legal salesman could dream. Guyol became one of them. Through the roaring 20s, he built an illegal whiskey business so large that the city's chief prosecutor, Solicitor General John Boykin, knew him by a title, the Liquor King of Atlanta. The empire was real enough to put him in federal prison for a stretch during Prohibition for importing illegal whiskey, and prison did nothing to slow him down. He came out and kept building. By the early 1930s, Eddie Guyol was a millionaire many times over, a career criminal described as one of Atlanta's financial 400. All of it built on liquor the law said no one could sell. Then, in 1933, the federal government took his business away by making it legal. The repeal of Prohibition in December of that year was celebrated across the country, and it bankrupted the criminal class overnight. Once anyone could buy whiskey at a store, nobody needed a liquor king. Bootleggers across America went scrambling for new work, and most of them landed in the same place: gambling. Guyol did not just land there, he essentially built Atlanta's version of the industry. He is credited as the first man to develop the numbers racket concept in Atlanta's individual neighborhoods, an illegal street lottery
that worked much like the legal state lotteries that exist today. Local salesmen and runners moved through the neighborhoods collecting small bets from thousands of ordinary residents, each player picking numbers and hoping theirs came up. There was no televised drawing. The winning numbers came from public information no one could rig or predict. Published figures like United States Treasury reports, bank clearance records, and total baseball scores printed in the newspapers. A resident could bet pennies, check the paper the next day, and dream. Multiply those pennies by tens of thousands of players every single day, and the game became a machine that printed money. Guile's machine was called the Home Company, and it was the largest of the 4 lottery syndicates operating in Atlanta at the time, alongside the Manhattan, the Metropolitan, and the Golden Dollar. The scale of the Home Company is the detail that separates Guile from every other forgotten local crook of his era. The syndicate employed somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people, an army of runners, salesmen, counters, and managers collecting bets across Atlanta and the surrounding counties from a customer base many times that size. The operation netted Guile an estimated $50,000 per day. In 1935, that daily take was more than most American workers earned in a decade. The $2,500 he carried in his pocket for a simple night at the movies was walking around money. He and his wife Myrtle lived alone in a $260,000 mansion in what newspapers called the Morningside section of Pelham Road, a house that still stands today at 1753 North Pelham Road in the Lenox Park area. To the respectable families around them, the Guiles were simply a wealthy, quiet couple. The house itself told the real story to anyone allowed to look closely. It was built with trapdoors and hidden compartments throughout, and after the murder, police determined the mansion was not just Guile's home. It was the operating headquarters of his entire syndicate. The numbers king of Atlanta ran a $50,000 a day criminal enterprise from behind the walls of a mansion his neighbors admired on their evening walks. By 1934, the quiet arrangement was cracking. In the summer of that year, DeKalb County Police raided a home in Brookhaven, arrested 18 people, and broke up a complete lottery operation. In connection with that crackdown, Guile and his right-hand man, Walter Cutcliffe, were indicted and convicted for running the lottery in DeKalb County. The punishment showed exactly how much power Guile had. He was fined $300. A man clearing $50,000 a day paid a $300 fine, roughly 10 minutes of income. Around the same time, Fulton County came after him with more fines and actual prison time for running the lottery. He never served a day, and he paid only a portion of the $1,000 fine. In the city directories, Guile's occupation was listed as lawyer, and whether it was that paper credential or simply his pocketbook, the courts of 2 counties could not hold him. The federal government noticed what the local courts could not touch. In 1935, W.E. Page, the collector for the Internal Revenue Service, placed Eddie Guile on his list of individuals the federal government should investigate for income tax evasion, the same weapon that had brought down Al Capone in Chicago 4 years earlier. The pressure on Guile was rising from every direction, from county prosecutors, from federal taxmen, and, most dangerously, from inside a business world where attention itself was a threat to everyone he worked with. Weeks after landing on that IRS list, he was shot dead in his driveway. The first moments after the murder revealed how the Guiol world actually worked. When Myrtle Guiol regained consciousness in the passenger seat beside her husband's body, the first person she summoned was not the police. It was Walter Cutcliffe, Eddie's right-hand man. Cutcliffe then called the police and an ambulance, which arrived along with members of the press, and before officers had even processed the scene, rumors were already moving through the legal hallways of downtown Atlanta, spread by an unnamed lawyer, that Eddie Guiol, the numbers king, had been shot. The investigation landed on the desk of Lieutenant C.E. McCrary of the Atlanta Police. What McCrary found confused him. As he dug into the victim, he confirmed Guiol's identity as the head of the home company, a millionaire built entirely on illegal income. But the man's reputation ran against every expectation. In the underworld, Guiol was known as a square shooter, a fair and popular operator who paid what he owed and treated people justly by the standards of his trade. According to the account McCrary gave the newspapers, he could not identify a single person with a clear reason to want Eddie Guiol dead. For several months, the trail sat cold. The break came sideways, through a completely different crime. While investigating an unrelated Atlanta robbery, McCrary traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, to interview two suspects. A Birmingham police detective mentioned something to him. One or both of the men he was chasing for the robbery was rumored to have fled to Birmingham after murdering Guiol. One of those two men was a 28-year-old named Odie Vernon Fluker. McCrary tied Fluker and an accomplice to the Atlanta robbery, got them convicted and sent to prison, and then kept pulling the Guiol thread with both men safely behind bars. He began watching Birmingham pawn shops for a .45 caliber pistol and found nothing. On a return trip to Birmingham, a second tip arrived, and this one had specifics. Fluker had shot Guiol, the tip said, with a .45 caliber pistol he had gotten from a Birmingham man. And that man had obtained the .45 by trading a .380 automatic for it at a Birmingham pawn shop before loaning it to Fluker, who carried it to Atlanta to kill the numbers king. McCrary went back through the pawn shop records and found the exact trade. A .380 automatic swapped for a .45 caliber pistol, made by a man named Hagen. When McCrary tracked Hagen down, Hagen confirmed everything. He had loaned that .45 to Fluker, and he had never seen the gun or Fluker again. The gun was gone, which should have ended the case, because without the murder weapon, there was nothing to match. Then McCrary asked Hagen one question that turned out to be worth everything. He asked whether Hagen had ever test-fired the gun. Hagen said yes. Before handing the pistol to Fluker, he had fired it into a tree in his own backyard. McCrary went to the tree, took Hagen's axe, and chopped several bullets out of the wood. He sent them to the FBI, and the laboratory came back with the answer that built the whole prosecution. The bullets pulled from the Birmingham tree had been fired by the same gun that killed Eddie Guiol in his Atlanta driveway. A murder weapon that no longer existed had been matched through slugs buried in a tree trunk in another state. As detective work, it was either one of the most remarkable investigations in Georgia criminal history or something else entirely. And which one depends on who is believed.
Odie Fluker was pulled out of a prison camp to stand trial for murder. The case against him was built entirely on circumstantial evidence: the pawnshop trade, Hagen's story, and the tree bullets, plus one piece of human testimony. Myrtle Guile identified Fluker in court, pointing to the eyes she had glimpsed on the running board that night. In 1936, Fluker was convicted of murdering Eddie Guile and sentenced to die in the electric chair. He never stopped insisting the Atlanta police had framed him, and the years that followed suggest that powerful people took that claim seriously. Fluker fought his conviction through the courts for the rest of the 1930s and was sentenced to death 5 separate times as the case was tried and retried. After his 6th retrial, the death sentence was finally commuted to life in prison. Over those years, the men who stepped up to defend him included a former Metro Police detective, a Superior Court judge, and even a governor. McCrary had never found any motive connecting Fluker to Guile, only the circumstantial chain, and the theory that has hung over the case ever since is not complicated. Guile was drawing heat from county prosecutors and federal tax investigators, which made him a danger to every associate in the business. His partners may have decided it was time for him to be retired, either by hiring Fluker or by hiring a different killer entirely and letting the police hang the case on a convenient robber from Birmingham. Fluker was released from the Georgia prison system in 1950, served another sentence in Florida for an unrelated crime, and lived out his final decades in California, where he died in Oakland in February 1981, maintaining his innocence to the end. Myrtle Guile died in Alabama in 1984. The clearest fact in the whole case is the identity of the man who benefited. Walter Cutcliffe, the right-hand man Myrtle called before she called the police, stepped directly into his dead boss's shoes. By the outbreak of World War II, Cutcliffe was known on the streets of Atlanta as King, running the remnants of Guile's lottery operation, along with a loan sharking business he operated with a partner named Harold J. Smoot called Walter's Finance Company, located on Edgewood Avenue. A loan from Cutcliffe and Smoot carried interest rates between 240 and 260%. Like Guile before him, Cutcliffe kept Georgia politicians close and paid. When he was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 1941 for operating the lottery racket, he never served a day because Georgia Governor E.D. Rivers pardoned him, alongside a batch of other convicted criminals who happened to have money to spend. Cutcliffe lived to 75, dying peacefully in 1976, 4 decades after his boss took a bullet through a car window. His son ran a loan sharking firm of his own. The permanent record of the Guile case is a stack of questions with a body at the bottom. Eddie Guile built 2 criminal empires in one lifetime, was killed at the peak of the second one, and within a few years was almost completely erased from the city's memory, while the man who inherited everything died old, rich, and pardoned. Odie Fluker spent 14 years in prison and faced the electric chair 6 times for a murder that a detective, a judge, and a governor apparently doubted he committed. Whoever actually ordered the killing of the Numbers King was never named, never charged, and never faced a courtroom. And after 90 years, the mansion at 1753 North Pelham Road, trapdoors and all,
is the only witness left standing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Guyal hid a criminal empire inside a mansion and listed himself as a lawyer in the city directory.
90 years later, Atlanta drug bosses were still running the same play, washing their money through real estate and luxury cars while family members kept the books. One of them rebuilt his empire within months of walking out of federal prison, and it was the paper trail, not the drugs, that buried him. Section 9. Tory Troop and the Invisible Syndicate. In 2007, Tory Leonard Troop walked out of federal prison in the same position most released prisoners find themselves in, starting over with a record. It was not his first time. The sentence he had just finished was for his second federal drug trafficking conviction, which meant the federal government had already caught him, convicted him, and imprisoned him twice for the same line of work. The system assumes that at some point that experience changes a man's direction. In Troop's case, it functioned as management training. In 2008, within roughly a year of his release, Troop organized a brand new criminal operation out of Fulton County, and this time he built it differently. The new syndicate would run for nearly a decade as a major cocaine supplier for Metro Atlanta and South Carolina, and for most of that time, law enforcement did not even see it. There were no nightclub shootings, no billboards, no rap labels, no bodies. There was a supply chain, a set of bank accounts, and a group of houses in ordinary neighborhoods quietly absorbing drug money. Tory Troop had learned from 2 federal convictions exactly what gets a trafficker caught, and he built an organization designed to do none of it. The first unusual choice was his hiring policy. According to federal prosecutors, Troop deliberately recruited other convicted drug traffickers to form the core of the new operation, including Franklin Troop, Joseph Alexander, and Rodriguez Redding, pulling in experienced men from Florida and Metro Atlanta who became the top-ranking members of the outfit. The United States Attorney's Office would later describe the group plainly as a ring of repeat offenders. On paper, that sounds reckless, since every member arrived already known to the federal system. In practice, it was the opposite. Every man in the leadership had already been through investigations, arrests, and prison. They knew how wiretaps worked, how informants worked, and how flashy spending brings agents to the door. A crew of first-timers makes first-timer mistakes. Troop staffed his syndicate with veterans, and the near decade of silence that followed suggests the strategy worked exactly as intended. The supply side of the operation ran like a small logistics company. The group sourced its cocaine from 3 separate directions: Colombia, the Bahamas, and Texas, which meant no single supplier or route could choke the business if it failed. Moving the product into the Atlanta area, the organization used private planes, cars, and shipments through UPS, spreading the risk across air, road, and the ordinary commercial package system that moves millions of boxes a day. Cocaine was not the only product. The group also smuggled bulk marijuana into the Miami area by boat, hauling as many as 9 bales at a time across the water. A bale of marijuana is a compressed block the size of a hay bale, so 9 at a time meant serious maritime smuggling, run alongside the cocaine pipeline as a second revenue stream.
None of these methods was invented by Troop. What stood out was the discipline of running all of them at once, quietly, for years, without the turf violence that usually forces a drug organization into the headlines. The distribution side reached 2 states. The organization supplied customers throughout metro Atlanta and across South Carolina, feeding networks of street-level dealers who turned wholesale cocaine into retail sales. Court records give one specific window into what happened after the product left Troop's hands. A customer named Ladurius Bailey took the powder cocaine and converted it into crack in large batches, cooking nearly 400 grams at a time for further distribution. 400 grams of crack breaks down into thousands of individual street doses, and Bailey was producing at that scale as just one customer of the network. The syndicate sat at the top of a pyramid it never had to touch. Wholesale weight in, converted product out, with layers of separation between the leadership and the corners where the drugs were actually sold. Every drug organization eventually faces the same problem, and it has nothing to do with drugs. It is the cash. Retail drug sales generate mountains of small bills, and those bills have to travel from the customers back to the bosses and then somehow enter the legitimate world without setting off alarms. Troop's network moved its money the same way it moved its product, through multiple channels at once. Some of the cash rode in cars, with people driving the proceeds from customers in Atlanta and South Carolina along the highways like ordinary commuters. Other bundles of cash were simply shipped, sent through the mail, FedEx and UPS, in packages moving through the same sorting facilities as birthday presents and online orders. Prosecutors traced proceeds flowing from the Southeast out to Texas through this system. Bulk cash is the most dangerous thing a trafficker can possess, because unlike drugs, it cannot be explained away as personal use. Troop's organization treated it like freight and kept it moving. Once the cash arrived, the laundering machine took over, and this is where the case becomes a story about family. To gather payments and clean the money, the organization used a network of bank accounts held by multiple individuals, and one of the key account holders was Troop's own wife, LaShawna Johnson. Another was a girlfriend Troop kept in Houston. The women's accounts received and moved drug proceeds, placing the money one step away from Troop himself on every bank record. On top of the personal accounts, Troop enlisted a business entity and its bank accounts to collect illegal profits and disguise them as revenue from legitimate business operations. Money that started as cocaine sales in a South Carolina parking lot could end its journey looking like ordinary company income deposited by ordinary account holders, none of whom were named Tory Troop. It was the same play Atlanta's Numbers King had run in the 1930s, with a city directory listing him as a lawyer, updated for the age of electronic banking. The structure also meant that when the collapse finally came, it would not stop at the men who sold the drugs. It would pull in wives, girlfriends, and relatives whose names sat on the paperwork. The spending followed the same rule: keep the kingpin's name off everything. The conspirators poured their profits into luxury and performance cars, homes, jewelry, and even cosmetic surgery. And the vehicles especially were bought in other people's names to avoid drawing law enforcement attention. The clearest example in the court record belongs to Rodriguez Redding. Redding convinced 2 of his own relatives to purchase and register 2 vehicles with his drug money: a $92,000 Mercedes CL63 AMG and a $65,000 Mercedes CLS 550. On paper, two ordinary family members owned two six-figure German cars. In reality, they were holding assets for a cocaine trafficker, and prosecutors noted what that favor eventually cost them. By agreeing to sign the paperwork, the relatives were drawn into the web of crimes, and their reward was the day federal agents arrived at their door. That detail runs through the entire Troop case. The organization survived by wrapping regular people around it: spouses, partners, relatives, a business, until the buffer between the boss and the evidence was made entirely of other human beings. The silence held for close to 10 years, and the government later explained why in unusually direct language. The United States Attorney's Office said the operation avoided detection for so long due to the group's extensive concealment efforts, its tight code of loyalty, and threats made to others. Concealment, loyalty, and fear. The same three walls every successful criminal organization builds. And Troop's ring of veterans maintained all three longer than most. The wall finally cracked through a multi-year cross-agency federal investigation, and in 2018, prosecutors indicted Troop and 6 other members of the network. Even then, with the organization exposed and its members facing federal charges, the appetite did not stop. While out on bond awaiting trial, 2 of the defendants ran a completely new scam, obtaining fraudulent loans from the Paycheck Protection Program and the COVID-19 Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, the emergency funds meant to keep legitimate businesses alive during the pandemic. Men already facing cocaine conspiracy charges reached into disaster relief money on their way to court. The fraud added federal charges to federal charges, and later, an order to repay the Small Business Administration more than $56,000 in restitution. In the end, nobody in the group gambled on a jury. All of the defendants pleaded guilty to their respective charges. Troop entered his plea on June 2, 2021, admitting to conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute cocaine and conspiracy to commit money laundering. In August 2022, United States District Judge Steve C. Jones sentenced him at age 52 to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 15 years of supervised release, and ordered him to forfeit 2 residential properties and $840,124. He was the last member of the ring to be sentenced. Franklin Benson Troop, 51, of Austell, received the same 8 years and 15 years of supervision and was ordered to forfeit $690,000. Joseph Anthony Alexander, 52, of Coral Springs, Florida, received 11 years and 3 months and a forfeiture of $111,860. Across the case, the numbers told the real story of what the syndicate had built and lost. Federal authorities seized 16 properties from the group in total, and judges ordered 5 of the convicted defendants to forfeit just short of $3.9 million in property, jewelry, and other assets combined. United States Attorney Ryan K. Buchanan summed up the harm by pointing at both ends of the operation: the dangerous drugs distributed into the community on one side, and on the other, the exploitation of the banking system and pandemic disaster funds, while the group bought homes in ordinary neighborhoods as hiding places for illegal profits. The main culprits, he said, would serve their prison terms and lose the spoils. Set against the other men in this list, the Troop case reads quietly, and the quiet is the point. He never matched the tonnage of the cartel-connected operations or the body count of the enforcers. His 8-year sentence looks small next to the decades handed to Atlanta's louder kingpins. The predictable price difference between pleading guilty to a money case and being convicted at trial for flooding a city with fentanyl. But the arithmetic of his life tells its own story. 3 federal drug convictions, a criminal career that restarted within a year of his second release and ran undetected for nearly a decade on the strength of other people's names. A wife on the bank accounts, relatives holding the cars, a business fronting the revenue, 16 properties quietly absorbing the profits of cocaine sold across 2 states. When it all came down, the people who had lent Troop their signatures learned that the paperwork was the crime, and the supervised release attached to his sentence was built to watch him for 15 more years, because the federal government had finally stopped assuming that prison changes Tory Troop's direction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Troop hid his drug money inside a handful of houses scattered across ordinary neighborhoods. The last man on this list took that idea to its extreme, using heroin profits to buy up more than a dozen properties in a single struggling Atlanta community, until one drug boss quietly became one of the West Side's biggest landlords. His tenants had no idea who really owned their homes. Section 10. Elgin Jordan, the kingpin who bought the neighborhood. On February 2, 2010, Alabama state troopers stopped a Ford F-150 pickup truck on Interstate 65 near Montgomery. The driver was a man from Atlanta named Elgin DeMarco Jordan. The truck looked ordinary from the outside, but its dashboard was not. Built into it was a hidden compartment that opened and closed with hydraulic controls, the kind of custom engineering that exists for exactly one purpose. Inside, troopers found $199,950 in cash packed into 13 vacuum-sealed plastic bags. Nearly $200,000 sealed like meat for a freezer, riding inside a secret compartment in a pickup truck on the interstate. Jordan told the troopers the money was not his. The state kept the cash, no charges were filed, and Jordan drove back into his life. It would take federal investigators 6 more years to fully understand what that life was. Jordan was not just a cocaine and heroin dealer suspected of heading a major Atlanta area trafficking organization. He was also, quietly, one of the biggest property owners in some of the poorest neighborhoods on Atlanta's west side. The drug money in that truck had a destination, and the destination was real estate. Jordan, then in his late 30s, had spent most of his life in Grove Park, a neighborhood in northwest Atlanta. He lived on North Eugenia Place, and he was known there long before federal agents knew him at all. His longtime attorney, Akil Secret, would later say that before drug addiction took hold of him, Jordan was admired around North Eugenia, and that if it were not for the drugs, he would have been considered something like a local hero in that part of the city. That is the defense version of the man. The government's version, laid out in court records, described the suspected head of a major drug trafficking organization dealing cocaine and heroin, and years later, a federal release added one more detail that connects him to the wider Atlanta underworld. Jordan sourced some of the drugs from members of the network run by Tory Troop, the quiet Fulton County cocaine syndicate of repeat offenders that operated undetected for nearly a decade. The invisible syndicates of Atlanta were not isolated islands. They supplied each other, and Jordan sat in that supply chain while building something none of the others had tried. He was buying the ground itself. The ground he bought sits in one of the most troubled corners of the city. His properties clustered in and around Grove Park and near English Avenue, the West Side neighborhood nicknamed The Bluff, an area known for years as a hub of the heroin trade for the entire Southeast. Buyers drove into The Bluff from across Georgia and beyond, and the neighborhood's open-air drug market operated alongside boarded houses, empty lots, and families who had lived there for generations and could not afford to leave. Then the 2008 housing crash hit, and property values in Atlanta's struggling neighborhoods fell through the floor. For most people, the crash was a disaster. For a drug dealer holding vacuum-sealed bags of cash, it was a clearance sale. During the real estate bust, Jordan was picking up properties for as little as $1,800 apiece. A house for less than the price of a used car, paid for with money that heroin and cocaine generated a few blocks away, in the same community the drugs were hollowing out. The trade destroyed the neighborhood's value, and then the trade's profits bought the neighborhood at the discount the destruction created. The buying spree grew into a portfolio that most legitimate investors would envy. Prosecutors counted 21 properties in all, with an estimated taxable value of $1.5 million, concentrated along North Eugenia Place, and spread across a half-dozen other locations in the city's poorer areas. Some were acquired under a company called A New Way of Living, a business entity prosecutors linked to Jordan, and that corporate layer mattered because property ownership in Atlanta's blighted neighborhoods routinely hides behind shell companies and addresses that lead nowhere. Residents dealing with a collapsing house next door often cannot even find out who owns it. Jordan operated inside that fog comfortably, and the scale of his holdings eventually outran his own memory. In a federal court filing, an undercover agent recorded Jordan admitting that he owned so many properties he sometimes could not keep track of them all. The man saying that was, at the same time, an active drug dealer. Investigators said Jordan sold drugs on North Eugenia Place itself, on the same street where he lived and owned most of his real estate. Landlord and supplier on the same block at the same time. What his empire looked like on the ground is the part of this case that separates it from every other on this list. The federal government later described the human cost in plain terms. Many of Jordan's homes sat vacant or were rented out, and their ownership prevented lawful citizens from purchasing the properties and peacefully living in those neighborhoods. Every boarded-up house on a block drags down the houses beside it. It invites squatting, dumping, and crime, and it signals to every family on the street that the block is dying. When the Atlanta Journal-Constitution walked North Eugenia after the case ended, most of the dozen houses and condos investigators tied to Jordan stood empty or boarded up, though a few looked well kept. A demolition team was in the middle of tearing down a condemned apartment building containing 3 condos tied to him. Residents approached by the newspaper said they knew of Jordan and then declined to say anything more about him. The silence of those neighbors, on a street where he was once admired, said as much about his position in the community as any court filing. Through the first half of the 2000s, Jordan kept surfacing in police matters and kept walking away. After the Alabama cash seizure in 2010 produced no charges, a dirt bike rider told police in 2011 that Jordan had intentionally struck him with a green Honda Accord.
Aggravated assault charges were filed and later dropped.
The booking photo from that arrest showed a man dressed sharply in a paisley shirt, looking nothing like the street-level image of a Bluff area dealer. Around that same period, a confidential informant told investigators exactly where Jordan's money was going: straight into real estate. The picture sharpened in 2015 when a search of one of his properties turned up what appeared to be heroin, cocaine, and hashish, along with scales for weighing product and a semi-automatic handgun tucked under a pillow in the master bedroom. Drugs, scales, and a gun within arm's reach of where a man sleeps describe a working trap house. And this one belonged to a property portfolio worth $1.5 million on the tax rolls. The evidence was assembling itself into a single portrait. The West Side landlord and the West Side drug organization were the same operation wearing 2 faces.
The takedown, when it came, was built the modern way, through money as much as drugs. A collaboration of multiple federal agencies, the Drug Enforcement Administration, Homeland Security Investigations, and IRS Criminal Investigation, ran a comprehensive financial investigation supported by the Fulton County Sheriff's Office and the Atlanta Police Department. The case drew on a wiretap, drug and money seizures, undercover recordings, and information from cooperating sources, people who, according to the government, feared violent retribution for talking. The mention of that fear is worth pausing on, because Jordan's public image in the case was a businessman with a portfolio, and the people quietly helping the government believed crossing him carried a physical price. The financial trail did what the street investigations of 2010 and 2011 could not. It connected the drugs, the cash, and the deeds into one prosecutable structure. Charges were filed in the spring of 2016,
and the case ended almost immediately. In June 2016, less than 1 month after being charged, Jordan pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute cocaine and heroin, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. There was no trial, no parade of witnesses, and no test of the evidence, which, for the cooperating sources who feared him, may have been the best possible outcome. The sentence came down in Atlanta Federal Court in November 2016. Elgin Jordan, then 42, received 8 years in federal prison, followed by 4 years of supervised release. The real punishment was measured in property. Prosecutors had seized 21 properties from him, and as part of the plea agreement, they returned 7, only 3 of which sat on North Eugenia. The remaining 14 properties, with a total tax-assessed value of more than $1.5 million, were forfeited to the government, stripping Jordan of the empire the drug money had built. The seizures were carried out as part of a multi-agency effort to loosen the grip of drug dealing on English Avenue and the surrounding West Side neighborhoods, on the theory that the houses themselves had become part of the machinery of the trade. Atlanta's United States Attorney at the time, John Horn, explained the deeper problem the case exposed. When a drug dealer has the resources to embed himself in a community through ownership of its properties and businesses, he said, the dealer becomes more visible and more woven into the fabric of the neighborhood. And prying that component loose so the neighborhood can become healthy and safe again becomes far harder for law enforcement. A dealer on a corner can be arrested in an afternoon. A dealer who owns the corner and the houses behind it has to be removed deed by deed. The 2022 federal release on the Troop Network completed Jordan's file with the detail that ties this list together. Jordan, it confirmed, had accumulated his 14 forfeited properties while sourcing drugs for members of Troop's operation. The same ring of repeat offenders that laundered cocaine money through bank accounts, businesses, and homes across the metro area. Two organizations, both allergic to attention, both converting drug profits into Atlanta real estate, and both dismantled by financial investigators following paper instead of powder. Between them, the government seized 30 properties, the 16 taken from Troop's group and the 14 taken from Jordan. An entire hidden portfolio of Atlanta homes that had been functioning as storage units for drug wealth, while actual families needed places to live. The permanent scar in the Jordan case does not belong to a single victim with a name. It belongs to blocks. It is the boarded houses on North Eugenia Place that stood empty while he owned them, the condemned building that had to be demolished, the lawful buyers who never got the chance to purchase homes in their own community, and the residents who watched a neighbor become a landlord, become a kingpin, and learned it was safest to say nothing. Jordan served his time and lost his portfolio, and the government hoped the forfeitures would help pry the drug trade's fingers off the West Side. The houses, the ones still standing, remain, some restored, some still boarded, each one a small monument to the years when the man collecting the rent was the same man supplying the block. 10 names, 1 city, and a full century between Eddie Guyol's driveway and Big Meech's billboards. The faces changed, the products changed, and the sentences got longer. But every one of these men was eventually undone by the same things: the money trail, the betrayal of someone close, or a single mistake made in plain sight. Atlanta produced them all, and Atlanta outlasted every one of them. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.